What's up, guys? Welcome to Vision Harry. We've got something special today. What if the Sorting Hat refused to touch Harry until Gringotts removed 93 illegal blocks and 7 tracking charms? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive in. Chapter 1, The Hat Speaks. The Great Hall of Hogwarts was, by any measure, the most breathtaking room Harry Potter had ever stood in. Not that this was saying much. He'd grown up in a cupboard. But even accounting for that, even accounting for the fact that his entire frame of reference for impressive architecture was the Dursleys' reasonably sized suburban home and a petrol station he'd once thought looked quite grand on account of its 2 stories, even with all of that working against his ability to calibrate, the Great Hall was something else entirely. The ceiling didn't exist, or rather it did, but someone had convinced it to pretend it didn't, and now it showed the night sky in all its late September clarity, stars scattered like spilled salt across black velvet. The candles floated. The tables gleamed. 400 students in black robes sat watching the door like they were waiting for something they'd been promised. Harry walked in with the rest of the first years and did not gawp. Not because he wasn't impressed, but because he'd learned very early that gawping at things invited people to notice you, and being noticed had never once worked out well for him. He walked near the middle of the cluster. Not at the front, not at the back. He'd been doing that his whole life without knowing he was doing it, calibrating his position in any group so that he was technically present and simultaneously easy to overlook. He kept his hands loose at his sides. He kept his face neutral. He listened to Hermione Granger 2 places to his left quietly recite the 4 house names under her breath like she was revising for a test, and he listened to Neville Longbottom 1 place to his right make a very small, very sincere sound of distress, and he thought, privately, that Neville might be the most honest person he'd met all day. The ghosts drifted through the walls. Someone shrieked. Several people laughed. Harry watched the staff table. Dumbledore sat at the center, and Harry had met him exactly once, 4 hours ago on the platform, and had immediately understood that this was a man who was accustomed to people being grateful to be in his presence. He sat now with his hands folded and his half-moon glasses catching the candlelight and a small, private smile on his face like the sorting ceremony was a play he'd written and was now enjoying from the front row. Harry looked away. Professor McGonagall set a 3-legged stool in front of the staff table. On it sat a hat. A battered, patched, ancient-looking pointed wizard's hat with a wide brim and a crown that had been repaired so many times the patches had patches. It sat on the stool without moving, which was what hats normally did, and then the brim opened like a mouth and it started singing. Harry listened to the song. It was impressively rhymed and covered, in broad strokes, the history of the 4 houses and their founders and their values. Gryffindor for the brave, Hufflepuff for the loyal, Ravenclaw for the learned, Slytherin for the ambitious. Standard stuff. The kind of thing you'd put on a brochure. The hat finished singing. The Great Hall applauded. McGonagall unrolled a long scroll of parchment and began reading names in alphabetical order. Abbott, Hannah. A girl with blonde pigtails walked up, sat on the stool, placed the hat on her head. 20 seconds. Hufflepuff. The hat announced, and the table on the far left erupted in cheering and the girl trotted over looking pink-cheeked and relieved. Harry watched each sorting with the particular attention of someone who has learned that understanding how things work is its own form of safety. The hat sometimes took longer. Sometimes it was nearly instant. Draco Malfoy, whom Harry had met on the train and immediately disliked, not because he was rude, which he was, but because his rudeness had the practiced quality of someone who had been praised for it, sat down, and the hat barely touched his hair before shouting, Slytherin, which seemed to surprise no one including Malfoy himself. Neville went up. The hat took a while. Harry watched Neville's hands clench and unclench in his lap while the hat sat on his head, and then, Gryffindor, and Neville let out a breath so big his whole body deflated like a punctured balloon, and Harry felt something warm and unexpected in his chest at the sight of it. Granger, Hermione. Hermione walked up like she was approaching a podium, sat down, put the hat on her own head before McGonagall could do it, and looked faintly impatient. Gryffindor. The Gryffindor table cheered. Hermione nodded, as if she'd expected nothing less, and went to join them. The names continued. Harry's palms were not sweating. He was aware that they should have been. He was about to sit in front of 400 people and have a hat determine where he'd spend the next 7 years of his life, but his hands were dry and his breathing was even and he felt, mostly, curious. Potter, Harry. A ripple. A murmur. It moved through the great hall like a stone dropped in still water, spreading outward from the point of impact, and Harry walked forward through the sound of his own name being whispered by people who'd never met him and felt nothing in particular about it. He sat on the stool. McGonagall lifted the hat toward his head. He watched it approach. It touched his hair. And stopped. McGonagall's hand didn't move. The hat sat just barely on the crown of Harry's head, and nothing happened, and the murmuring in the great hall slowly shifted from excitement to uncertainty. 5 seconds. 10. 15. The silence became the particular kind that happens in large rooms when large numbers of people collectively hold their breath. Then the hat spoke. Not the quiet internal voice Harry had half expected, the kind of murmuring inside your skull that the older students had described on the train. The hat spoke out loud, in its cracked, ancient, leather-and-dust voice, and it spoke at full volume, and every word it said landed in the great hall like a stone thrown through glass. I will not. McGonagall's hand twitched. I beg your pardon. I said, the hat repeated, with the particular clarity of something that has never needed to repeat itself and is therefore doing so only as a courtesy, I will not. I cannot, in good conscience, perform a sorting on this child. The great hall's silence turned absolute. Not the held-breath kind. The stunned kind. The kind where people stop processing and just sit there with their mouths slightly open. Harry didn't move. He sat on the stool with the hat barely touching his head and kept his face very still, because something was happening inside him that he didn't entirely understand yet, a kind of recognition, like hearing a word in a language you didn't know you spoke. Why not? McGonagall asked, and to her credit, her voice was steady, though her face had gone the color of old chalk. Because, the hat said, what I am touching right now is not a child's natural magical core. What I am touching is a magical core that has been bound. Compressed. Suppressed. Restricted through illegal magical interference on a scale that I have not encountered in 400 years of sorting. I can feel at least 90 blocks on this boy's core, possibly more, and I can feel no fewer than 7 active tracking charms woven into his magical signature, at least 3 of which were placed without the consent or knowledge of any legal guardian. The hat paused. I was made to sort children. I was not made to sort children who have been tampered with. I will not do it. Not like this. The silence that followed was the longest Harry had ever lived through, and he had spent 11 years in a cupboard. Then the great hall exploded. Not in a violent way. In the way that 400 people simultaneously deciding they need to say something sounds like, a roar of voices, a scraping of benches, heads turning, hands gesturing, the staff table erupting into its own private emergency. Harry heard none of it distinctly. He was listening to the thing the hat had just told him and turning it over in his mind, examining it from different angles, the way you turn a new object in your hands to understand its shape. 90 blocks. 7 tracking charms. He'd always known something was wrong with him. Not in the way the Dursleys had meant it when they said it, they'd meant it as an insult, as a diagnosis of deficiency, as the explanation for why he didn't deserve a real bedroom or a birthday cake or a name that wasn't boy. He'd always understood, with the particular clarity of children who are forced to think in order to survive, that they were wrong about the specific thing they were saying. He wasn't broken. He wasn't less. But he'd always known there was a shape to him that didn't match what people expected. A gap between what he felt building inside him sometimes and what actually came out. Like trying to breathe through a straw and not being able to understand why breathing felt harder than it should. Now he had a number. 90 blocks. Give or take. Mr. Potter. Dumbledore's voice cut through the noise from the staff table, calm and warm and carrying the particular authority of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation somewhere more, I want to know what it means," Harry said. He said it clearly and without heat and without looking away from the space in front of him, and because he hadn't raised his voice either, it cut through the great hall's noise in a different way than Dumbledore's had. Dumbledore's voice commanded silence by weight of authority. Harry's got it because no one had expected an 11-year-old sitting on a three-legged stool to sound like that. The hall quieted. "Mr. Potter," McGonagall said, her voice carefully controlled, "I think it would be best if we spoke privately." The Hat said it in front of everyone. Harry turned his head and looked at her. "That means everyone already heard it. There's no version of this that stays private." He looked at the hat, which was still resting lightly on his head. Can you tell me anything else?" "A great deal," the Hat said, sounding somewhat gratified to be addressed directly. "The blocks are layered. Several were placed before you could walk. The earliest ones I can identify have the signature of a specific caster, though I won't name names in a hall full of students, that would be inappropriate. Others were added incrementally. The tracking charms are, frankly, excessive. One of them I would describe as a leash, not a tracker. It is designed not merely to locate you but to flag and suppress any instance of accidental magic that reaches a certain threshold. So when I did accidental magic, it was reduced." "Yes. How much?" The Hat considered. "I would estimate you have been operating at somewhere between 8 and 12% of your actual capacity for your entire life." Someone at the Hufflepuff table fainted. Harry heard the thud distantly. 8 to 12%. He breathed in. Breathed out. Kept his face still. "Right," he said. "Mr. Potter." Dumbledore had risen from his chair, and his voice had shifted, still warm, but with an undertone Harry clocked immediately as management. The tone adults used when they wanted to redirect a situation without appearing to redirect it. "This is clearly a distressing revelation, and I understand, I want to go to Gringotts." Dumbledore blinked. It was, Harry suspected, a rare occurrence. "I beg your pardon." "Gringotts." Harry lifted the hat off his own head, an act which made McGonagall make a strangled sound, and set it carefully back on the stool. He stood up. He was small for 11, the Dursleys had never exactly prioritized his nutrition, but he stood up straight and looked at Dumbledore across the length of the Great Hall and felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear but was much more useful than either. Goblins handle magical inheritance and core audits. That's what the Hat just described needing, a core audit. I want one. Tonight. Hogwarts doesn't typically, I'm not asking Hogwarts. I'm asking you, specifically, whether you're going to help me get there, or whether I'm going to have to figure out how to send an owl to a bank at 9 o'clock at night while everyone in this hall watches. Harry paused. I'd rather not make this more awkward than it already is. The silence had a different quality now. 400 students sitting absolutely still, watching Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard alive, defeater of Grindelwald, supreme mugwump, chief warlock, navigate an argument with an 11-year-old who had just been told he was operating at 8% capacity and hadn't cried once. Dumbledore looked at Harry for a long moment with an expression that was impossible to read precisely because he had clearly been making it unreadable for most of his life. "Minerva," he said quietly, "please see to the rest of the sorting. Mr. Potter, if you'll come with me." Harry looked at the remaining first years, Neville standing near the back, wide-eyed, and Hermione with her arms crossed and her forehead furrowed in a way that looked less like disapproval and more like she was trying to solve a very complex equation, and then he walked to follow Dumbledore, and the Great Hall remained in perfect stunned silence until the door closed behind him. Then the noise was spectacular. The room Dumbledore brought him to was small and off to the side of the entrance hall, the kind of room that existed in large buildings to have conversations that weren't meant to be overheard. A fireplace. 2 chairs. A side table with a tea service that appeared to have materialized when they weren't looking, which Harry supposed it probably had. McGonagall arrived 3 minutes later, closed the door, and stood with her back against it with the specific posture of someone maintaining professional composure by pure architectural determination. "Sit down, my boy," Dumbledore said gently, gesturing to one of the chairs. Harry sat. He accepted this not because he was tired or because he wanted tea but because sitting meant thinking, and he needed to think clearly. "First," Dumbledore said, settling into the opposite chair and folding his hands, "I want you to know that your reaction this evening showed remarkable composure. What the Sorting Hat revealed was it true?" Harry asked. Dumbledore paused. The hat. Was what it said true? Harry watched Dumbledore's face carefully. He'd gotten very good at watching people's faces during the pause between a question and their answer, because the pause was usually more informative than the answer. The blocks. The tracking charms. Was it telling the truth? The Sorting Hat, Dumbledore said carefully, is an ancient magical artifact, and its perceptions, while generally reliable, can sometimes. That's not a yes or a no. McGonagall made a small sound. Dumbledore looked at Harry for another long moment, and whatever calculation was happening behind those blue eyes, Harry didn't look away from it, and eventually Dumbledore said, very quietly, "No. It is not." The fire popped. "So it was true," Harry said. "There are blocks on my magic. There are certain protective measures that were taken when you were very young, for reasons that, 90 of them." "The hat may have been imprecise in its 93, you said earlier," Harry interrupted. "Or that's what you started to correct it to before you stopped yourself." McGonagall turned to look at Dumbledore. Dumbledore's expression shifted in a way that was very small and very controlled, but Harry saw it, because he was watching for exactly that kind of shift, and what he saw was that Dumbledore was recalibrating. Reassessing. He'd walked into this conversation expecting to manage a frightened child and he was sitting across from something else entirely, and he was intelligent enough to recognize the difference. "You are very perceptive, Harry," Dumbledore said, and this time the warmth in his voice had a note of genuine surprise. "People underestimate you when they think you're scared," Harry said. It wasn't a boast. It was just a thing he'd learned. "I want to go to Gringotts. Tonight. I have the right to a magical inheritance audit. I know because I read Hogwarts, a history, and there's a chapter on student rights under the Education Charter of 1742, which references the Goblin Wizard Accord of 1689, which gives any magical person over the age of 10 the right to request an independent assessment of their magical core if a licensed magical assessor, and the Sorting Hat absolutely qualifies, has indicated irregularity." He reached into his robe pocket and produced a small index card on which this information was written in very small, very neat letters, and placed it on the table. "I wrote it down on the train because I thought I might need it." Silence. "You thought you might need it," McGonagall said slowly. "I've always known something was wrong with my magic. I just didn't know what." Harry looked at Dumbledore. "I'd like to go to Gringotts tonight, please. If you won't arrange it, I'll them myself and wait in the entrance hall until they send someone." "I'd rather not wait, but I will." Dumbledore looked at the index card. He looked at Harry. He picked up his teacup and took a very long, very deliberate sip, and Harry understood that this was the kind of sip that contained an entire interior argument, and he waited. "Flow Network," Dumbledore said finally. "We can be there in 15 minutes. "Minerva, would you?" "I'm coming," McGonagall said firmly. It was the tone she'd used at the sorting, the one that didn't invite negotiation. Dumbledore nodded, slowly. "Very well." At 9:47 on a Tuesday night in September, 3 people stepped out of a fireplace in the lobby of Gringotts Wizarding Bank, a small boy with round glasses and untidy black hair, a tall woman in emerald green robes who looked like she was attending someone's execution and was personally offended by the necessity, and the most powerful wizard in Britain, who looked, for the first time in possibly decades, like he was somewhere he hadn't planned to be. The lobby of Gringotts at night was different from Gringotts during the day. The chandeliers were dimmed to half-light. The vast marble hall threw long shadows. Most of the teller windows were dark. But goblins, Harry noted, didn't really stop working. Several of them looked up from ledgers and parchment stacks with the particular evaluative gaze of creatures who are permanently unconvinced of human competence. One of them, tall for a goblin, which still put him at about chest height on Harry, with a face like a carved walnut and eyes the color of old gold, walked toward them with the purposeful stride of someone who had been expecting this visit for longer than he was going to admit. "Dumbledore," the goblin said, without any of the title or deference that Harry had noticed most wizards appended to the name automatically. "I see you've brought the boy." "Sharpclaw," Dumbledore said. His voice was perfectly composed, but Harry noticed, very faintly, that he did not say good evening. "We find ourselves in need of, we know what you need." Sharpclaw looked at Harry. His gaze was direct and assessing and contained none of the particular quality of adult attention that Harry had grown up with, that mixture of pity and wariness and carefully maintained distance that people gave to the boy who lived whenever they thought about what the name meant. Sharpclaw just looked at him the way you'd look at a contract you were about to review. "You are Harrison James Potter." "Harry," Harry said. "Harry Potter. You wish to request a full inheritance audit and core assessment. And a full accounting of any magical modifications to my person or my core," Harry added. "Including their origin, their date of placement, and the identity of the caster if that information is available." Sharpclaw's gold eyes moved to Harry with an expression that Harry couldn't quite parse, but if he'd had to name it he might have said interested. "That is a very complete request for an 11-year-old. I had time to think on the way over." "Indeed." Sharpclaw looked at Dumbledore for one long, flat moment. "You should know, Dumbledore, that the results of a formal Gringotts audit are sealed under Goblin law. The contents cannot be accessed or suppressed by any wizarding authority, including the Ministry and including you. The boy is entitled to full disclosure of everything the audit finds." "I am aware of Goblin law," Dumbledore said. "Then you are aware," Sharpclaw said, with the careful, precise enunciation of someone choosing each word like a tool, that any illegal magical modification discovered during this audit becomes, automatically, a matter of record in our vaults, and that if that record indicates criminal activity, we are within our rights to report it to the DMLE, the ICW, and, in cases of modifications to a minor, the Office for the Protection of Magical Children." A pause. "I mention this so that no one is surprised later." Dumbledore said nothing. "Please," Harry said. "Let's start." They took him to a room deep in the bank, down a corridor that smelled of stone and old metal and something Harry couldn't name, a sharpness, like the air before lightning. The room was small and circular with walls of smooth dark rock and a single raised platform in the center on which sat a chair that looked like it had been carved from the same stone as the walls. Four goblins attended in silence, each one holding a different instrument, things that looked nothing like medical equipment and exactly like what medical equipment would look like if it had been designed by creatures who considered precision the only legitimate form of care. A fifth goblin stood apart from the others. Older. The weight of age sat on him differently than it did on humans, not in softening, but in condensation, like everything unnecessary had been pressed away over centuries until only the essential remained. He wore dark robes and his hands, folded in front of him, were steady. "Ragnarok," Sharpclaw said. "Director of Gringotts." Ragnarok looked at Harry. "Sit down, young Potter." Harry sat. "This will take some time," Ragnarok said. "It will not be comfortable. The assessment reads your core directly, and a core that has been under compression for a decade will respond to being read." He paused. "Do you understand what I mean?" "It might hurt," Harry said. "Yes. That's fine." Ragnarok looked at him for a moment. Then he nodded once, sharp and approving, and said something in gobbledygook to the four attending goblins, and they began. Dumbledore and McGonagall stood outside the room. Harry knew this because he'd watched Sharpclaw very politely and very firmly indicate the door and then stand next to it, and Dumbledore had walked through it, and McGonagall had followed after one last look at Harry, not a worried look, he noticed, or not entirely. It was more like the look of someone who was reassessing something they thought they'd understood. The assessment took 47 minutes. Harry did not scream. He gripped the arms of the stone chair until his knuckles went white and he breathed in a specific pattern he'd worked out years ago for surviving things: slow in through the nose, controlled out through the mouth, focus on one fixed point and don't let go of it. And he stayed very still while the goblin instruments moved around him like the hands of a clock and made sounds he couldn't describe, and light moved under his skin like something trying to find its way out of a container that had always been too small. At the 30-minute mark, one of the attending goblins said something to Ragnarok in gobbledygook. Ragnarok's expression changed, not dramatically, just the smallest tightening at the corners of his eyes, the kind of expression that on a goblin face, Harry was beginning to understand, was the equivalent of an actual human being dropping their jaw. At the 40-minute mark, another goblin said something. At the 47-minute mark, Ragnarok held up one hand, and everything stopped, and Harry sat in the silence and breathed and unclenched his hands from the arms of the chair, and looked at his palms, which were red. "Well," Ragnarok said. Harry waited. 93 blocks, Ragnarok said. Of varying type, age, and complexity. 7 tracking charms. 3 intense suppression overlays. 1 will-binding cast, that one is quite old, predates the others, which is interesting, and what I can only describe as a death anchor tied to an object whose nature we would need additional time to fully assess. Harry turned this over. Death anchor. A piece of foreign magic. Not yours. Bound to your scar. Ragnarok's tone was clinical, but his golden eyes had something in them that was the opposite of clinical. We will need to address this separately. It is not minor. I see. Harry filed this away. He'd come back to it. The blocks. Can they be removed? Yes. With appropriate authorization, yours, as you are the affected party, and appropriate compensation for the work, given its scope. Ragnarok paused. It will take several hours. It may take overnight. Can you tell me who placed them? Several were placed by someone whose magical signature I recognize. Ragnarok looked at him steadily. A significant number bear the signature of Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Harry heard McGonagall make a sound in the corridor outside even through the closed door. He sat quietly for a moment with that information. How many? He asked. Of the 93 blocks, 51 are his. The others were placed by healer Christoph Welsby, who has been retired from practice for 8 years and cannot be compelled to testify, and 6 bear signatures we have not yet identified. Ragnarok watched him. The tracking charms are uniformly his. Harry looked at his hands. The redness was fading. He turned them over, looked at the backs, turned them over again. And the intense suppression overlays? His signature. All 3. The fire in the walls, small and contained in a bracket near the ceiling, gave a soft, tired pop. Right, Harry said. Then, because he was 11 and exhausted and had been operating at 8% of his capacity his entire life and had just spent 47 minutes having that demonstrated, and because the room was small and quiet and the goblins were, he sensed, the most honest people he'd been in a room with in a very long time, right? Let's remove them, then. It was 2:30 in the morning when the door opened and Harry walked out. McGonagall was still there. She had been sitting on a stone bench against the wall in the corridor, her spine perfectly straight, her hands folded, her face doing something complicated. She stood when she saw him. Harry was different. Not visibly, he was still small, still underfed, still wearing glasses that were slightly too large for his face, still dressed in Dudley's cast-off robes that didn't quite fit. But there was something different in the way he occupied space. The way you could feel the presence of a storm system before you saw it. He had been carrying a weight his entire life and not known it was a weight, and now it was gone, and his body didn't quite know what to do with that yet, and so what it did was expand, very slightly and very quietly, like a held breath finally released. Dumbledore stood further down the corridor. He had, at some point in the last 5 hours, aged. Not magically. Not literally. But there was something about the set of his shoulders that had changed, and when he looked at Harry, for the first time since they'd met, Dumbledore's face was not arranged for a specific effect. It was just a face. An old man's face with something in it that might have been regret or might have been calculation or might, for the first time, have been both at once. Sharpclaw stood beside Harry. He held a sealed folder of documents, the audit report, the record of removals, the full legal accounting that would be filed in Gringotts vaults and simultaneously copied to the DMLE and the ICW and the Office for the Protection of Magical Children, all before sunrise. Your copy, he said, handing it to Harry. In perpetuity. Magically sealed to your signature only. Thank you, Harry said. He turned and looked at Dumbledore. The corridor was quiet. It smelled of stone and old money and, very faintly, from somewhere below them, the coal and sulfur of dragon breath. Did you know, Harry said, before tonight, that I already suspected something was wrong? Dumbledore said nothing. I just want to know if I'm starting from scratch with you, Harry said. He wasn't angry. His voice was steady and even and completely without the performance of neutrality that adults used when they were suppressing emotion. He was genuinely asking. Or if I'm starting from somewhere further back. Harry, I'm going back to Hogwarts tonight. I'm going to be sorted, and I'm going to attend school, and I'm going to do all the things I came here to do. Harry tucked the sealed folder under his arm. But I want you to know that I know. And I want you to know that I know you know I know. He paused. I don't want to be angry at you. Anger takes up space I'd rather use for other things. But I'm not going to pretend I don't have questions, and I'm not going to stop asking them. He looked at McGonagall. She was looking back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. He'd thought earlier it was grief, but looking at it now, in the dim light of the Gringotts corridor, he thought it was closer to something like recognition. Could we go back? Harry asked her. I'd still like to be sorted. Even if it's 3 in the morning. McGonagall stood up very straight. Yes, she said. I believe we can arrange that. They walked toward the Floo station in the lobby, the 3 of them. Harry walked between them, which was either protection or escort depending on how you looked at it. He carried his sealed folder. He was no longer operating at 8%. He had no idea yet what 100% felt like. He was about to find out. The great hall was empty at 2:50 in the morning. The candles had burned low. The enchanted ceiling showed a sky gone deep and starless with cloud cover. The long house tables sat in their rows in the dark, waiting. McGonagall set the stool. Set the hat. Harry sat down. The hat lowered onto his head, and this time it touched his hair, and this time there was no hesitation, no refusal, but there was a pause, of a different kind. A long, interior silence while the hat read something it had never read before. Something that had been locked for 10 years and was now, quite suddenly, open. Oh, the hat said, very quietly, private, this time, just for Harry. Oh, I see. What do you see? Harry thought back at it. I see what you are, the hat said. What you actually are. Not the version they made for you. A pause. You know, I've been doing this for 400 years. I've sorted every remarkable witch and wizard who came through those doors. I have never, another pause, longer. Where would you like to go? Where should I go? That's the wrong question. The right question is where do you want to go? Because you, Harry James Potter, with the blocks off and the magic running true, you could go anywhere. You fit everywhere and nowhere at once. That's unusual. Put me where I'll be most useful, Harry thought. Not the most powerful. The most useful. The hat was quiet for a moment. Then something in its brim shifted, and it said, loudly enough for an empty room, loudly enough, Harry thought, for the portraits and the ghosts and the stones themselves to hear, Gryffindor. Its voice echoed off the ceiling and the empty tables and came back changed, the way all sounds do when they've bounced off something old and are returning full of the memory of it. Harry took the hat off. Set it on the stool. Stood up. The room was empty. The candles guttered in the late-night draft. Outside, the grounds of Hogwarts lay dark and quiet, and somewhere in the castle, he knew, 400 students were asleep, and tomorrow they would wake up and go to breakfast, and the story that had started tonight would already be 3 steps ahead of anything they'd expected. McGonagall was watching him from beside the door, and her face had finished doing its complicated thing and arrived somewhere that looked, finally, just sad. "You should sleep," she said. "In a minute." Harry looked at the Gryffindor table. Long and wooden and dark and solid. He walked over to it and put one hand flat on the surface, just to feel it. The wood was cool under his palm. Old. Permanent, in the way that things in this castle were permanent, not unchanging, but present, in the way that mattered. He thought about the number 8. 8%. He'd been living at 8% of himself, and he'd still managed to be here, still managed to find the index card in the library, still managed to keep his hands from shaking in front of Dumbledore. What would 12-year-old me have done at 100%? He thought, and then immediately, what will I do now? He didn't have an answer yet. That was fine. He'd been in the dark longer than this. "Okay," he said, and took his hand off the table. "I'm ready." He followed McGonagall out of the great hall, through the entrance hall, up the wide stone staircase, into the castle that was going to be his home for 7 years, into a life that was, finally and completely and without qualification, entirely his own. Behind him, in the dark, the Sorting Hat sat on its stool and said nothing, because it had already said everything it needed to say. The candles burned low. The clouds shifted outside. One star appeared in the enchanted ceiling, and then another, and then the whole vault of the sky opened up, brilliant and cold and absolutely without limit. Chapter 2, The Counting of Chains. Harry woke up at 6:15 the next morning before anyone else in the Gryffindor first-year dormitory was moving. This was habit. The Dursleys had always wanted breakfast early, and 10 years of conditioning didn't evaporate overnight even when other things did. He lay on his back in the 4-poster bed with the hangings drawn and the sounds of 4 other boys sleeping around him, Ron Weasley's deep, uncomplicated snoring, Neville's quieter breathing, 2 others he hadn't properly met yet, and he stared at the inside of the red velvet curtain and took inventory. His magic felt different. That was the only way he had to describe it. Like the difference between trying to see through foggy glass and just seeing. Clean and direct and with a depth to it that he hadn't known was missing until it was there. He'd fallen asleep last night before he could properly examine it, McGonagall having walked him to the dormitory herself and introduced him to a bewildered prefect named Percy Weasley who had been waiting up with the determined expression of someone who considered waiting up part of his official duties, and Harry had found his bed and gotten into it and been asleep before the curtains were fully closed. Now he was awake, and he was paying attention. He reached out with his magic, not literally, not with his hands, but in the internal way you probe a sore tooth with your tongue, carefully, wanting to know the extent of it. What he found made him go very still. He'd expected more. In a vague, general sense, he'd expected the removal of the blocks to feel like being given something back. Like a door opening. What it actually felt like was less like a door and more like discovering that the room he'd been living in his entire life had walls that weren't walls, that what he'd thought were solid surfaces were actually just partitions, and beyond them was a house that went on much further than he'd understood. His core wasn't bigger. It was the same core. It had just been compressed for so long that when the compression was removed it didn't so much expand as remember its actual shape. He could feel the castle. That was the surprising thing. He could feel Hogwarts, not loudly, not invasively, but in the way you can feel weather through the walls of a building. The magic in the stones. The wards. The ancient, saturated, accumulated magical presence of 1,000 years of intense human magical activity packed into one structure on a Scottish hillside. It hummed, very faintly, at a frequency he could now perceive, like a note he'd always been able to hear but now could finally locate and name. He got up, dressed quietly, picked up the sealed Gringotts folder from his trunk where he'd put it last night, and went downstairs to the common room. It was empty and warm, the fire already lit, by magic, presumably, though he found himself wondering about the logistics of that for the first time and reminding himself that he was going to be learning about the logistics of things like that very shortly. He sat in an armchair close to the fire and opened the folder. The Gringotts audit report was 43 pages long. He read every word. It was the kind of document that was written in careful, precise language designed to be legally airtight, which meant it described devastating things in the vocabulary of accounting, which made them somehow more devastating rather than less. Each block was catalogued with its date of placement, method, function, and caster signature. The earliest ones, placed when he was 15 months old, were listed simply as core limiter type A, severity, major, function, reduction of raw magical output by approximately 40%. The note in the margin, in Ragnarok's careful script, said, placed within days of the primary traumatic magical event. Intent, unclear, possibly protective, possibly suppressive, possibly both. Possibly protective. He held that thought. Turned it over. Put it down. The tracking charms were documented separately, and the documentation for those was, if anything, more precise and more damning. 3 were standard locator charms, the kind that reported his position to a specified recipient at regular intervals. 2 were intent flaggers, they didn't just track where he was, they tracked what he intended to do magically and transmitted a summary. 1 was the suppression leash the hat had mentioned, which activated automatically any time his accidental magic exceeded a specified threshold and reduced the output before it manifested. The 7th, and this one had a separate section in the report, written in slightly different handwriting, which Harry suspected meant Ragnarok had written it personally, was something the document described as a loyalty primer. He read that section 3 times. A loyalty primer was a charm designed to create a subtle but persistent positive emotional association with a specified individual, triggered by proximity and reinforced by repeated contact. It didn't override your emotions. It just weighted the scales. Made a particular person feel inherently trustworthy, inherently safe, inherently worth deferring to. The way a smell could make you feel at home without you knowing why. It had been tuned to Albus Dumbledore. Harry set the report down on his knee and looked at the fire. He sat with it for a long time. Outside, the castle began to wake, he could hear it in the walls, the way he could hear the magic now, a building chorus of movement and voices and footsteps on stone. The common room fire crackled. Somewhere in the dormitory above, someone dropped something heavy and swore. He picked the report back up and kept reading. By the time people started coming downstairs, Harry had finished the report and started on the supplementary documents, which covered his inheritance status, which was, apparently, considerably more complex than he'd known, encompassing 3 separate vaults including a family vault and a trust vault and something called the Potter Legacy Vault which had conditions attached to it that he was going to need a goblin legal specialist to explain, and he'd started making a list on a piece of parchment that he'd found in his bag. Neville came down first. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs, saw Harry already there, and his expression went through 3 emotions in quick succession, surprise, uncertainty, and then a kind of tentative warmth. "You were sorted last night," Neville said. "After everything." "Around 3 in the morning," Harry said. McGonagall came and woke up the prefect. Neville came and sat in the chair across the fire, tucking his feet under him. He was wearing pajamas with small broomsticks on them and he looked slightly embarrassed about this. "She said you'd been sorted into Gryffindor and we should make you feel welcome and then she left." A pause. Percy spent about 10 minutes explaining what comfortable temperature the tower was kept at. "That's very Percy Weasley of him," Harry said. Neville looked at the folder and the parchment list on Harry's knee. "Is that, from Gringotts? Audit report." Neville was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone who wanted to ask something and was weighing whether it was intrusive. Harry had noticed this about him on the train, this consideration he had, the way he thought before speaking rather than after, which was rarer than it should have been. The hat said 93 blocks, Neville said carefully. And 7 tracking charms. 3 intense oppressors. A will binding and a loyalty primer. Harry looked up from his list. All removed now. Neville processed this. A loyalty primer, he said slowly. That's illegal, isn't it? That's seriously illegal. It's a Class A illegal modification under the Magical Interference with Persons Act of 1863. The penalty is 5 to 10 years in Azkaban per application. Harry said it the way he'd read it. Factually. The file's been sent to the DMLE and the ICW already. Gringotts filed it before sunrise. Neville looked at him with an expression that was hard to name. It wasn't pity, which Harry was grateful for, and it wasn't that particular look people gave you when they decided your life was more dramatic than theirs and they wanted to observe it from a careful distance. It was something more like solidarity. I didn't know any of that had happened to you, Neville said. Neither did I. Harry glanced back at his list. I'm starting to understand why I always felt like things didn't add up. Ron Weasley tumbled down the stairs at that point with the energy of someone who'd woken up 10 minutes ago and was already moving at full speed, his hair flattened on one side and his school robes on sideways, and saw Harry and stopped. You're the one from the sorting, Ron said. Then, apparently aware that this was not the most articulate greeting, I saw what happened. Everyone saw. He dropped into the remaining armchair. My mum's going to faint when she hears. She might, Harry agreed. The hat talked, Ron said. He had the directness of someone for whom social filtering was an optional function. Out loud. To the whole hall. Said you were tampered with. He paused. Were you? Obviously you were, the hat said so, but are you all right? Harry considered the question properly, which Ron seemed to notice, because he waited instead of filling the silence. I think so, Harry said. I'm different than I was yesterday. But different in the right direction, I think. Ron nodded, satisfied. Fred and George are going to be absolutely insufferable about this. They'll want every detail. Your brothers. Twins. 3rd year. They were at the sorting. They sent me a note last night, it was just the words bloody hell repeated 47 times. Ron grinned, and it transformed his face entirely, and Harry found himself grinning back without meaning to. Breakfast in the Great Hall was an exercise in being the most interesting thing in the room, which Harry had never been before and found significantly less enjoyable than he might have imagined. Every table looked at him when he walked in. The Slytherin table went very quiet in a pointed way. The Ravenclaw table appeared to be debating something intensely. The Hufflepuff table waved at him, collectively, which was disarming. His own table, the Gryffindor table, parted to let him sit with the collective warmth of people who had decided they approved of him, which was its own kind of pressure. He ate eggs and toast and didn't look at the staff table, because he wasn't ready to yet. Hermione Granger sat across from him with a bowl of porridge and an expression that was doing the math equation thing again. She'd been at the sorting. She'd heard everything. She had, Harry suspected, spent a significant portion of last night researching magical blocks and the Magical Interference with Persons Act and Goblin audit procedures, and was now experiencing the specific discomfort of someone whose understanding of how institutions work has been materially disrupted. The Sorting Hat is legally a licensed magical assessor under subsection 4 of the Educational Standards Act, she said, apparently by way of greeting. Yes, Harry said. So its testimony constitutes valid legal grounds for a mandatory DMLE investigation. The audit report from Gringotts probably covers that, but yes. She looked at him. Do you want to talk about it? Not right now, Harry said. But thank you for asking. She nodded, satisfied with this, and went back to her porridge and appeared to file the conversation under pending in whatever elaborate internal organizational system she was running. A folded note arrived with the morning mail. Harry's owl, he'd bought her at Diagon Alley, a snowy white bird he'd named Hedwig for reasons the book she was named after would have found ironic, dropped it into his toast and landed on his shoulder and bit him affectionately on the ear. The note was from Sharpclaw at Gringotts, and it was written in the crisp, unemotional prose of a professional who is delivering important information and has deliberately not put any of their feelings about that information into the writing. Harry read it once, then folded it and put it in his pocket. "Good news?" Neville asked from beside him. "The DMLE has acknowledged receipt of the audit report," Harry said. "And the ICW has opened a preliminary inquiry. And the Office for the Protection of Magical Children has requested a meeting within the week." He picked up his toast. "And apparently my family vault contains significantly more than I was told, because the interest has been accruing since 1981 without anyone providing me with statements." "How much more?" Ron asked, with the candor of someone for whom money had always been a real and concrete thing rather than an abstraction. "Enough that it's in a separate column," Harry said, and left it at that. He looked up, finally, at the staff table. Dumbledore was in his seat. He was eating, or appearing to eat, with the composure of a man who had woken up this morning and decided that composure was the appropriate strategy. He caught Harry's eye. Harry looked back at him steadily for 3 full seconds, then looked away and finished his toast. McGonagall was watching Harry with that same complicated expression. Snape was watching Harry with an expression that was harder to read, not hostility, exactly, though Harry knew from Ron and the Hogwarts, a history that Snape's historical attitude toward Harry's father made hostility a reasonable baseline assumption. It was more like a man encountering a situation he had prepared extensively for and finding it different from his preparation in ways he was rapidly reassessing. Quirrell, at the far end of the staff table, was not watching Harry. He was very pointedly not watching Harry, which was itself a kind of watching. Harry noted all of this and filed it. The morning schedule started with Transfiguration, McGonagall's class, which meant that the first class of Harry's actual magical education was being taught by a woman who had stood in a Gringotts corridor at 2 in the morning while a document was produced that implicated her colleague and headmaster in serious criminal magical interference. She walked into the classroom, transformed her desk into a pig and back into a desk to demonstrate that she was absolutely fine and nothing unusual was happening, and began the lesson. She was extraordinary at it. Harry could see that immediately, the kind of teacher whose expertise was so complete that instruction looked effortless, every example precisely chosen, every correction offered with the minimum required words. The kind of teaching that assumed you were capable and helped you meet that assumption. Harry took notes. Clean, organized notes, because it turned out that with 93 blocks removed, his ability to process and retain information had also been running at approximately 8%, and now that it wasn't, he found that the concepts were clicking into place with a speed and clarity that was frankly a little startling. Hermione, seated across the table from him, glanced at his parchment halfway through class, looked at it more carefully, and then looked at him with an expression that had moved from the math equation frown into something more open. "That's the theory of molecular magical restructuring," she whispered. "That's not in the first-year curriculum. That's not in the second-year curriculum." "I was just following the logic," Harry said quietly. "It seemed like if the spell works by realigning the fundamental essence of an object's identity along a new magical axis," Hermione finished. "Yes. That's the principle. That's Newt level." She stared at him. "You worked that out just now? From the pig demonstration?" "I had a lot of blocks removed," Harry said. "I think my brain is catching up." She opened her mouth, closed it, and returned to her own notes, which Harry noticed she then spent several minutes quietly revising. They were set the task of turning a match into a needle. The theory was, understand what a match is, understand what a needle is, understand the magical principle by which one can become the other, and then ask your wand to be the mechanism of that understanding. Harry held his wand and thought about the match. He didn't try to cast a spell. He just thought about the match, and what it was, and what a needle was, and the magical relationship between the two, and let the wand find the natural expression of that understanding. The match became a needle. Fully, Instantly, with none of the gradual half-transformation that most of the other students were achieving. Silver and sharp and perfectly proportioned. McGonagall walked over, picked it up, examined it. Set it down without a word. Walked to the front of the room. "Full marks," she said, without looking at him. "For the record. In case anyone is wondering about the grading criteria." Neville's match, which he'd been concentrating on with the full weight of his anxiety, had turned approximately 2/3 of the way and then stopped. He was staring at it with the expression of someone who'd been told his whole life that he wasn't good at this. Harry looked at Neville's match, and then at Neville, and said quietly, "You've almost got it. You're trying too hard, you're telling it to change instead of letting it understand why it should." Neville looked at him, then at the match. He relaxed, very deliberately. He stopped pushing. The match finished its transformation into a needle, slow and slightly wobbly but complete. Neville stared at it. Then he looked at Harry with an expression that Harry recognized because he'd felt it himself last night, walking out of the Gringotts assessment room. The expression of someone who has just discovered that they are bigger than they thought. Charms was after lunch, taught by Professor Flitwick in a classroom where the ceiling was close and the windows were charmed to show sunny weather regardless of the actual sky outside. Flitwick was short and enthusiastic and had a quality about him that reminded Harry of Ragnarok, actually, the condensed, precise quality of someone for whom competence was its own reward. He'd been a champion duelist in his younger years, which Harry had read in Hogwarts, a history, and you could tell, if you looked, in the economy of his movements. They were introduced to the theory of charm casting, intent, focus, pronunciation, wand movement as 4 interdependent pillars, and then given a simple levitation charm to practice. Wingardium Leviosa. Hermione got it on her 3rd try, with perfect technique. She was, Harry could see, the kind of student who understood the theory completely and then applied it precisely and consistently, and the result was magic that was technically flawless and exactly what you'd expect. Harry got it on his 1st try, which was fine. What was less fine was that his feather went up 12 feet before he remembered to moderate the intent behind the cast, which he had not yet had time to calibrate for the difference between 100% of his core and whatever percentage he'd been working at yesterday. The feather hit the ceiling. Flitwick made a sound somewhere between a gasp and a squeak. "Mr. Potter, that was the levitation charm, which we will be learning proper height control for in approximately week 3, Flitwick said, in the careful tone of someone addressing a situation the textbook didn't cover. "Perhaps a little less, sorry," Harry said. "I'm still calibrating." "Calibrating," Flitwick repeated. He looked at Harry with an expression that was the professorial equivalent of Ragnarok's gold-eyed assessment. "Yes. I had heard, that is, yes. When you feel ready to try again, Mr. Potter, perhaps aim for 2 feet." Harry tried again. The feather went to exactly 2 feet and stayed there, perfectly level. Flitwick stared at it for a moment, then turned to address the rest of the class, but Harry noticed he kept glancing back, with the look of a man who was quietly revising every plan he had for the year. Quirrell's defense against the dark arts class was last. Harry had been thinking about Quirrell since breakfast. Specifically about the way Quirrell had been very carefully not looking at him. He'd read Quirrell's name in the staff listings in Hogwarts, a history, recently appointed, previously a Muggle studies professor, had taken a year's sabbatical to gain first-hand experience, which even in the dryly worded biography had the quality of a polite fiction. The stutter was new. Harry had also read about Quirrell from students in Diagon Alley, and none of the descriptions of him from before the sabbatical mentioned a stutter. He walked into the defense class with all of this catalogued and sat near the middle of the room and watched Quirrell begin his lesson with the specific attention of someone who is looking not at what is being presented but at the person doing the presenting. The lesson was on types of dark creatures, a theoretical overview, reading from the textbook, which was an overly dramatic and somewhat inaccurate volume called The Dark Forces, a guide to self-protection that Harry had already found 3 factual errors in. Quirrell read from it with a slightly distracted quality, his turbaned head occasionally tilting as if listening to something that wasn't in the room. Harry could feel something from the front of the room. Not clearly, It was murky, distorted, like a sound heard through water. But it was there, and it was dark, and it had the particular quality of contain things that wanted very badly not to be contained. He filed that too. After class, when the other students were packing up and filtering out, Harry stayed in his seat. He waited until the room was empty except for him and Quirrell, who was erasing the blackboard with a wand movement that was mechanical and distracted. "Professor Quirrell," Harry said. Quirrell turned. His eyes found Harry and skittered sideways immediately, which told Harry everything about whether Quirrell was afraid of him. Mr. Potter," Quirrell said. "I was wondering," Harry said pleasantly, "about the defensive theory for encounters with possessed artifacts. We didn't cover it today, but I've been reading ahead and I noticed there was a chapter in the supplementary texts. I wanted to know if you had any practical advice to add." Quirrell's face went completely still. Just for a moment. The stutter dropped. Then, "Possessed artifacts can be quite dangerous, why yes. The first principle is distance." "Distance," Harry said. "Right. What if distance isn't possible? Then I would suggest seeking assistance from a qualified. What if the qualified assistance is the problem?" Harry asked, still pleasantly. "Hypothetically." The class was empty. The afternoon light came through the windows at a low autumn angle, striping the floor in gold and shadow. Quirrell looked at Harry, and whatever was looking through Quirrell's eyes in that moment was something old and sharp and deeply, reflexively wary, and Harry looked back at it without blinking. "Hypothetically," Quirrell said, and this time there was no stutter at all, "one should trust one's own magic above all advisors." "Helpful," Harry said. He picked up his bag. "Thanks, Professor." He walked to the door, stopped. "You should drink more water, by the way. You look dehydrated." He left. In the corridor, he leaned against the stone wall for a moment and let himself breathe. His heart was going faster than he'd like. Not from fear, or not entirely. From the particular tension of having just had two conversations simultaneously, the surface one and the real one, and from the understanding, clear and cold and settling in his chest like a stone settling in still water, that whatever was living in Quirrell's turban had just worked out, that Harry knew it was there. That was fine. Let it know. He pushed off the wall and went to find Neville. The rest of the week moved fast. Harry learned things at a pace that the curriculum was not designed for, and tried to moderate this in every class except when moderating it would mean getting something wrong, at which point he simply got it right and dealt with the fallout. The fallout was, in most cases, professors looking at him with the expression of people recalibrating. Snape was the exception. Potions, Thursday morning. The dungeon classroom. The torches in the brackets, the pickled things in jars, the distinctive smell of stone and simmered chemistry, and something underneath it all that was magical and alive. Snape arrived in the way people arrive when they've spent years perfecting an entrance. Black robes, dark presence, voice like the room had gotten colder. "You are here to learn the subtle science and exact art of potion making," Snape said. His eyes moved across the class with the practiced sweep of a man cataloging, and when they reached Harry they stopped for just a moment longer than anywhere else. "As there is little foolish wand waving here, many of you will hardly believe this is magic." He began to walk between the desks. "I can teach you how to bewitch the mind and ensnare the senses. I can tell you how to bottle fame, brew glory, even stopper death." He stopped at Harry's desk. "Potter," he said. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" The class went quiet. Harry looked up at Snape and saw, underneath the careful construction of intimidation, a man who'd spent years building an expectation around this particular desk, this particular moment, this particular child. He'd expected James Potter's son, arrogant, unprepared, relying on fame. "Draught of living death," Harry said. "One of the most powerful sleeping potions known to magic. Asphodel is in the lily family, which associates it in magical folklore with the grief of lost memory, in combination with wormwood, which symbolizes bitterness and regret. The potion is thought to produce a sleep that contains neither dreams nor time. The method of combination is critical. If the asphodel is added to the infusion while it's too warm, the reaction produces a sedative rather than a soporific. He paused. There's also an interesting interaction with certain dark enchantments. I've been reading ahead. Snape looked at him. The expression on his face was complex. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't this, and unlike Dumbledore, Snape didn't have a practiced composure that could absorb the unexpected without showing. Something shifted in his eyes, not warmth, not yet, possibly not ever, but a recalibration of a different kind than Harry had seen in the other professors. More personal. "Where would you look," Snape said quietly, "if I told you to find me a bezoar?" "Stomach of a goat," Harry said. "Antidote to most poisons." "I'd check the student supply stores first, then the restricted stores, then if it were urgent, the Ollery might have someone who could source one from a magical creature supplier within the hour." "And the difference between monkshood and wolfsbane?" "Same plant," Harry said. "Different common names for aconitum. Also called aconite. Extremely toxic, useful in several potions for its magical amplifying properties when correctly diluted, associated with lycanthropy in both potion and dark arts contexts. And, I believe you used a different method of preparation in your published essay in Potions and Potency Quarterly in 1987, compared to the standard Goshawk method. I thought your approach had merit." The dungeon was completely silent. Snape stared at him. "Your published essay," Snape said flatly. "It was in the Hogwarts library," Harry said. "In the Potions Periodicals section. I was looking for background reading before term." He paused, then added, because he'd noticed the specific way the silence in the room had sharpened, and because he didn't believe in performing ignorance, "I wasn't trying to show off. I genuinely found it interesting." Snape turned away. Went back to the front of the room. 10 points to Gryffindor, he said, in the exact tone of someone saying something that cost them something real. "Mr. Potter seems to have done his preparation. The rest of you," he swept the class with a look that suggested he found their preparation significantly less impressive, "would do well to follow the example." Hermione looked at Harry. She was sitting beside him and her expression had settled into something that was no longer the math equation face. It was something warmer, more direct, the face of someone who had just decided to revise her opinion of a person. "You read the Potions Periodicals," she whispered. "I read everything I could find before term," Harry said. "I've always known I was behind on something. I just didn't know what." She looked at him for a moment, and then she nodded, and something in her posture shifted, the specific uncrossing of arms, the leaning forward rather than back, that meant a Hermione Granger had decided to be in the same category as you rather than watching you from the adjacent one. "Right," she said quietly. "Me too." The letter from the DMLE came on Friday morning, addressed to Harry Potter directly, with the ministry seal on the envelope and the handwriting of someone who'd clearly been told to write it and considered the assignment personally awkward. Harry read it at the breakfast table while Neville read his herbology notes and Ron worked through a plate of sausages with the focused enthusiasm of someone who considers breakfast a competitive event. The letter informed him that his case had been assigned to Senior Auror Amelia Bones, director of the DMLE, which told Harry that either his case was considered important enough for the senior staff or it was considered politically volatile enough to not want to assign to someone junior. Possibly both. Director Bones requested a meeting at his earliest convenience, noting that given his age she would communicate first with his designated guardian. Here the letter paused, in the way letters could pause when they were hedging, and continued with the phrase "or appropriate adult representative," and that the ICW inquiry was ongoing but she wanted to handle the domestic aspects personally. Harry wrote back that he was available Saturday morning and that he would prefer to speak for himself, that if a guardian representative was required he would bring his Gringotts account manager Sharpclaw in that capacity as the goblins currently held legal authority over his person pending the resolution of the guardianship review, and that he looked forward to the meeting. He sent it with Hedwig before anyone at the staff table could see it. "Sharpclaw is your guardian?" Neville said. "Temporarily." When Gringotts identifies illegal modification of a minor, they have the legal right to assume a protective advisory role pending investigation. Sharpclaw offered, and I accepted. Harry picked up his pumpkin juice. Dumbledore is technically my guardian of record. I thought it was better to have someone independent in that role while this is all being sorted out. Ron had stopped eating. He was looking at Harry with an expression that was, in its own way, more honest than most of the adult expressions Harry had encountered this week. "You're 11, Ron said. "Yes. You arranged for a goblin to be your legal guardian. Temporarily. While simultaneously having the DMLE and the ICW both actively investigating the most powerful wizard in Britain. Well. Allegedly most powerful." Harry glanced at the staff table, where Dumbledore was talking to Sprout and appeared perfectly composed. "I haven't actually tested the theory." Ron stared at him for another moment. Then he burst out laughing, the big, uncomplicated laugh of someone who finds something genuinely funny and doesn't feel the need to perform anything about it, and said, "Fred and George are going to absolutely love you." Hermione, who had been listening with the focused quality of someone committing things to memory, said, "You've been planning this since Gringotts, haven't you? The Goblin Guardianship. The direct communication with the DMLE. The preemptive legal positioning." "Since the corridor outside the assessment room," Harry said. "I had about 20 minutes while I was waiting for the paperwork." She stopped. Started again. "That's quite strategically sophisticated for someone who spent last year living with Muggles." "The Muggles weren't particularly sophisticated," Harry said. "But they were consistent, and being around people who are consistently unkind teaches you to think several steps ahead. It's a very practical education." Hermione was quiet for a moment. Then she said, quietly, "I'm sorry that happened to you." It was a simple thing to say and she said it without drama, the way she did everything, direct and honest and without embellishment. Harry looked at her and felt that warmth again, the same thing he'd felt when Neville had said something similar, the warmth of people being genuine at you in the way that was completely different from people pitying you. "Thank you," he said. He meant it. He got the second letter that afternoon. This one had no seal. It arrived through the castle's internal message system, a small folded square of parchment that appeared on his desk during his free period, slid under the door of the empty classroom where he'd been practicing wandless control exercises, which he'd read about in a text that was technically a fourth-year supplementary and had decided were fundamental enough to start immediately. He unfolded it. "Mr. Potter, I wonder if I might ask you to come to my office this evening after dinner. There are things I believe we need to discuss. I understand if you'd rather not, and I will respect your choice. I would simply ask you to know that my intentions, despite what the record now shows, were never malicious toward you. Whatever you think of me, I ask only for the chance to explain." APWB Dumbledore. Harry read it twice. He considered the loyalty primer that had been on his magical signature for 10 years, tuned to this person's frequency, the way it had made every encounter with Dumbledore feel inherently warm and safe and trustworthy, a warmth that was now gone, removed with the charm, and replaced with what he actually felt, which was something considerably more complicated and considerably more honest. He thought about what the hat had said. What you actually are. Not the version they made for you. He folded the letter and put it in his pocket alongside the Sharpclaw note and the DMLE letter, all three of them together, because he was beginning to think of them collectively as documentation. He wrote back. One line. "Not tonight. But I will come when I'm ready. I'll let you know. HP." He sent it via the same message system and went back to his wandless exercises. Specifically, he was working on the problem of controlling ambient magical output, the thing Flitwick had identified as the levitation issue, what happened when you had significantly more magic than you'd had access to yesterday and needed to calibrate the difference between what you intended and what you produced. He found the focus point quickly. It was less like learning something new and more like remembering something old, something he'd always known but never had enough of himself available to access properly. He held a quill at the desk and thought about it, and the quill rose exactly as much as he wanted it to, held exactly steady, and came back down exactly when he asked it to. He tried it with 3 quills. Then 6. Then the entire contents of his bag, which rose uniformly to 3 feet off the floor and then came down in the precise reverse of the order they'd gone up, without him looking at any individual item. He sat very still in the empty classroom with his things settled back in his bag and the late afternoon light coming in sideways through the old glass, and felt the castle humming underneath him, and thought, for the first time, that he understood what it felt like to be exactly himself. Not more. Not performing something. Not managed into a shape that someone else had decided was appropriate and safe and useful. Just exactly himself, with the full weight of everything that actually meant. The feeling was extraordinary. He sat with it for a long time. Saturday morning, he and Sharpclaw met Amelia Bones in an office in the ministry that she'd apparently had repurposed specifically for this meeting, neutral ground, not a formal interrogation space, a table and chairs and tea that nobody was pretending wasn't also a social convention designed to reduce tension. Amelia Bones was a broad-shouldered witch with a monocle and gray-streaked dark hair and the kind of face that had decided a long time ago that its primary expression would be precise. She looked at Harry when he came in with Sharpclaw, and then at Sharpclaw and then back at Harry, and her expression adjusted by approximately 1 millimeter in a direction that Harry read as "I see." "Mr. Potter," she said. "I've read the audit report." "All 43 pages?" Harry asked. "Twice," she said. She gestured to the chairs. Harry sat. Sharpclaw sat. She sat across from them. "I want to be direct with you, because I think you're someone who prefers direct." "Very much," Harry said. "The audit report constitutes grounds for a criminal investigation into the illegal magical modification of a minor. The DMLE has opened that investigation. The ICW has opened a parallel inquiry under international statute." She folded her hands on the table. "Given the identity of the primary caster named in the report, this is not a simple case." "I understand that," Harry said. "There will be pressure," she said. "From multiple directions. There will be people who believe that whatever was done for good reasons, and there will be people who believe the investigation should not proceed, and there will be people who are both of those things at once." She looked at him steadily. "I want you to know that my office will conduct this investigation with full independence regardless of that pressure. I want you to hear it directly, not through official channels." "I believe you," Harry said. She blinked, a small reaction, quickly controlled. "You don't know me." "No. But you came here on a Saturday, you rearranged a ministry office to make the meeting feel less formal, and you told Sharpclaw in advance that you wouldn't have a second official present because you wanted me to feel comfortable speaking freely. People who want to manage a situation don't do those things." He paused. "Also, Sharpclaw trusts you, and goblins don't do that lightly." Sharpclaw made a small sound beside him that was the goblin version of a laugh. Amelia Bones looked at Harry for a long, quiet moment, and then she said, "You know, Mr. Potter, you are considerably more than anyone prepared me for." "I know," Harry said. "I'm just finding that out myself." They talked for 2 hours. Harry answered her questions fully, and she answered his, and Sharpclaw said little but watched everything with those gold eyes and occasionally produced the precise legal document at the precise moment it was needed, with the timing of someone who has been doing this for centuries and has no interest in performing drama about it. When they were done, Amelia Bones walked them to the door of the office and stopped. She looked at Harry with her direct gaze and said, "One more thing. I need to ask you something off the record." "All right. Are you afraid?" Harry thought about it. Really thought about it, not the quick reassurance reflex, not the performance of composure he'd developed from years of needing it, but the actual honest interior answer to the question. "No," he said. "I was afraid when I didn't understand what was wrong. Now I know. Knowing is different from afraid." He paused. "I'm cautious. I think cautious is appropriate." She nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "I think it is." Outside the ministry, in the autumn London grey, Sharpclaw walked beside him to the apparition point and said, without preamble, "You did well in there. Thank you." "She will protect this investigation," Sharpclaw said. "She has her own reasons for wanting it to proceed, which are separate from yours, which means your interests and hers are aligned rather than dependent. This is the best kind of alliance." He glanced at Harry with those evaluative gold eyes. "Do you understand what I mean?" "She has someone she wants to protect," Harry said. "Or someone she lost. Something like that." "Her niece," Sharpclaw said. "Susan Bones. First year, Hufflepuff." A pause. "She has thought, for several years, that the wizarding world's protection of its children has been insufficient. Your case gives her the legal mechanism to address that insufficiency on a much larger scale than just yours." Harry absorbed this. "She's using my case as a lever." "Yes. Does that bother you?" Harry thought about it. "She told me directly that her interests in this are her own. She didn't pretend she was doing it purely for me. So no." He looked at the grey London sky. "A lever that opens the right door is still useful. She can use my case. I'll use her investigation. That's not betrayal, it's just honest exchange." Sharpclaw looked at him for a long moment. "You know," the goblin said, "in 400 years of working with wizards, I have very rarely said this." He paused. "I'm glad we're on the same side." "Me too," Harry said. He meant it. They went back to Hogwarts. The castle met him at the gates the way it always did now, that low, satisfied hum in the stones, the magical presence that he was beginning to understand wasn't just ambient history but something older and more deliberate. Hogwarts noticed him. Had possibly always noticed him and been waiting for him to be large enough to notice it back. He walked through the gates, up the path, into the entrance hall, into the castle that was his for the next 7 years, and felt, for the second time since Thursday morning, since the first time that had come as a surprise and was now becoming something like ordinary, exactly like himself. The great hall smelled like roast chicken. Someone in the corridor ahead was laughing. The autumn light came through the high windows at the angle that meant late afternoon, and the stones were warm with it, and Harry Potter walked through all of it with his hands loose at his sides and his head up and no weight on him anywhere. He had work to do. The stone. Quirrell. Dumbledore, eventually, when he was ready. 100% of himself to learn to use. But for right now, in this moment, just this. The warm stone and the smell of food and the sound of laughter in the corridor. Just the simple, extraordinary fact of being entirely, unambiguously here. Chapter 3, What Fire remembers the first time Harry properly lost control of his magic. It was a Tuesday in October and it was entirely Draco Malfoy's fault. Not the way these things were usually Malfoy's fault, the petty, performative provocation of someone who'd grown up being applauded for cruelty and mistaken the applause for wisdom. This time it was specific. Malfoy had cornered Neville in the corridor outside the Charms classroom, taken his Remembrall, and held it up above Neville's reach, and he'd been saying something with the particular casual venom of someone who has practiced saying things that hurt without looking like they're trying, and when Harry turned the corner and saw it, something happened in his chest that had nothing to do with thought. The Remembrall flew out of Malfoy's hand and across the corridor and landed in Harry's palm. Not because Harry cast a spell. Not because he consciously reached for it. The magic moved before he did, a clean, sharp pulse that carried very specific intent, which was that doesn't belong to you and you should not have it, and the Remembrall obeyed. The corridor went quiet. Malfoy looked at his empty hand. Then at Harry. His expression cycled through startlement and arrived at something that wanted to be contempt but couldn't quite get there, because contempt requires a level of confidence that the last 3 seconds had materially disrupted. That, Harry said pleasantly, walking to Neville and handing him the Remembrall, is his. You used wandless magic, Malfoy said. There was something in his voice that was trying to be accusation and came out as awe. In a corridor. You just, yes. Harry looked at him. Not unkindly, not with the hot edge of the thing that had moved in his chest a moment ago. Just directly. Malfoy, I don't actually want to be your enemy. But I'm going to need you to understand that taking things from people who haven't done anything to you isn't something I'm going to walk past. Malfoy's eyes were pale gray and sharp, and in them, under the performance of aristocratic boredom he'd been clearly working on since birth, there was something that was actually paying attention. My father says, your father isn't here, Harry said. And whatever your father says, you're the one standing in the corridor. You get to choose what that means. Malfoy stared at him for a long moment. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. His two associates, Crabbe and Goyle, solid and uncomplicated as a pair of wardrobes, followed him, though Goyle cast one look back at Harry that had considerably more thought in it than anyone gave him credit for. Neville was clutching his remembrall. He looked at Harry with the expression of someone who is recalibrating their baseline for what a normal Tuesday can contain. You did wandless magic, Neville said. Accidentally, Harry said. I'm working on the calibration. You accidentally did wandless magic across a corridor. The intent was very clear, Harry said, which was the most honest explanation he had. The magic followed the intent. Neville looked at the remembrall, which was glowing red in his palm, and then he laughed, startled and genuine and surprised out of himself, and said, I actually can't decide if that's terrifying or brilliant. Both, Harry said. Definitely both. Come on, we're going to be late for charms. He told Flitwick about it that afternoon, after class, because Flitwick was the person most likely to give him a useful answer and least likely to make it into something administrative. The tiny professor listened with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely interested and said, wandless accidental magic at this level is, not typical, Mr. Potter. Not for a first year. I know, Harry said. I'm trying to get better at controlling it. I'm doing the exercises, the intent focus, the output moderation. But when the emotion is strong enough it seems to bypass the control layer entirely. Flitwick tilted his head. When you say emotion, protective, Harry said. That specific feeling. It happened once before, a few days after arriving, I was in the common room and a second year said something that upset Neville and a book fell off a shelf across the room and hit him in the back of the head. Which I feel slightly bad about, actually, though not very much. Flitwick's mouth twitched. He pressed his fingertips together. The first principle of wandless magic is that intention must be specific enough to differentiate between what you want to happen and what you're willing to let happen. The issue you're describing is that protective emotion generates very specific intent, it's not diffuse, it's targeted, which is why it produces action rather than ambient discharge. The solution isn't to suppress the emotion. I didn't think it was, Harry said. No, I imagine not. Flitwick looked at him. The solution is to create a very thin but very clear layer of consciousness between the feeling and the action. Not a wall, a window. You can see through it. You can feel through it. But it requires an instant of choice before the magic moves. He paused. This is, incidentally, the foundational principle of advanced dueling. The difference between a master duelist and an exceptional student is that the master has made that window automatic. The choice still happens. It just happens very fast. Harry sat with this. How do I practice it? Flitwick brightened. He had the quality of a man who has spent his whole career waiting for students who ask the right questions, and the right question always made him light up. Provocation exercises, he said. You deliberately create the emotional state and then practice inserting the window. I can help you design a curriculum if you're interested. Yes, Harry said. Please. He left Flitwick's classroom with a 3-page practice outline and the feeling that this was what the subject was supposed to feel like, not rote learning and technique drills, but the kind of teaching that assumed you were actually trying to understand something rather than pass a test. He was halfway down the corridor when he felt it. Not wandless magic, not his own. Something external. Something that brushed against his magical awareness the way a cold draft finds the gap under a door, subtle, and directional, and carrying the specific quality of a presence that was trying not to be noticed. He turned around. The corridor was empty. He stood very still and extended his awareness the way he'd been practicing, not reaching out aggressively, just listening, the way you listen for a sound you've heard once and aren't sure of. The corridor smelled of stone and old torch smoke. The afternoon light slanted in from the high window at the far end. There was something on the third floor. He couldn't have explained how he knew. He just knew the way he knew things about the castle now, through the hum of it, the magical current that ran through the stones the way blood ran through a body, and through the particular disruption in that current that something on the third floor was causing. A deliberate disruption. Concealed, but not well enough concealed to hide from something that could feel the hum. He went up. The third-floor corridor was supposed to be forbidden. There'd been a speech at the start of term from Dumbledore, first floor, second floor, third floor forbidden, and other things besides, the usual institutional disclaimer that existed, Harry had noted, specifically as a filter, it would stop students who followed rules, and it would not stop students who had good reasons not to. He wasn't sure what category he was in. Probably a third one. He didn't go to the locked door at the end of the corridor. He stopped halfway down and stood in the cold stone quiet of it and just paid attention. The disruption he'd felt from below was more distinct here. Something was stored in the room at the end of the corridor, behind the locked door, and whatever it was had a magical signature that was dense and layered and old. Not as old as the castle, but old for a human-made object. He also felt something else. Something recent. Footprints, in a magical sense, the residue of magical presence, the way strong magic leaves an echo that the castle's own magic recorded without commentary. Someone had been up here recently. More than once. He crouched down in the corridor and put his hand flat on the stone floor, the way he'd put his hand on the Gryffindor table the night he was sorted, and closed his eyes and just listened to what the stone remembered. At least 5 visits. Most recently last night. The magical signature on those visits was complicated, layered, as if more than one magical entity had been here, which was interesting in the specific way that the most dangerous things always presented as interesting first and dangerous second. He stood up and stepped back from the door. He was not going through it tonight. Not because he was afraid, but because going through a door without knowing what was on the other side was strategy, not bravery, and strategy was to know before you acted. He had the shape of it now, the object's presence, the frequency of the visits, the identity of the most recent visitor, which he was beginning to form a very clear theory about. He needed more information before the theory was useful. He went back to Gryffindor Tower and wrote 3 pages of notes. October passed. The castle settled into the particular rhythm of a term in full swing, classes and meals and homework and Quidditch tryouts, which Harry attended because McGonagall had asked him to and because he discovered, on his first time on a broom, that flying was the one thing he loved without complication. The broom was the only place where the difference between yesterday's Harry and today's Harry didn't require calibration. He'd always been able to fly. The 10 years of blocks hadn't touched it, flying was more reflex than magic, more body than core, and so when he got on the school broom for the first time and launched himself off the ground, it was like coming home to a place he'd never technically been. McGonagall had put him on the Gryffindor Quidditch team as seeker before he'd been on the broom for 10 minutes, which produced a specific category of outrage from the older students that lasted approximately 1 practice session and then dissolved entirely because Harry at full magical capacity with a Nimbus 2000 on a Quidditch pitch was something you simply could not argue with. He was fast in a specific way that transcended technique, not just the physical speed of a small, light person on a good broom, but the ability to read the pitch, to feel the movement of the snitch the way he felt the castle, as a presence in his wider awareness, directional and warm and alive. He caught it, in his first practice, in 4 minutes. Oliver Wood, the Gryffindor team captain, had stared at him from across the pitch with the expression of a man who has just been given something he wanted so badly that receiving it felt suspicious. "Do it again," Oliver had said. Harry had caught it again in under 3 minutes. Oliver had sat down on his broom in midair and covered his face with both hands. Neville, who'd come to watch, had applauded from the stands, specifically and individually, because everyone else was either cheering or processing. What Harry noticed about Quidditch, beyond the flying, beyond the speed, beyond the way the pitch opened up around him and everything else went quiet, was that it was the first place in the wizarding world that valued what he actually was rather than what they expected the boy who lived to be. The team didn't care about his scar. They cared that he could find a snitch in a thunderstorm. That was, he decided, the correct set of priorities. He also used the practice sessions to think. He did his best thinking in motion. On the ground, sitting still, his mind was organized and methodical, the list-making, the cataloging, the strategic patience that 10 years of survival had taught him. But on a broom, thinking became something more fluid and less deliberate, and problems that resisted frontal approach often yielded sideways. The Quirrell problem, for instance. He'd been circling it for weeks. The thing in the turban, the dark presence, the quality of contained wrongness that he could feel from the front of defense class every lesson, was obviously Voldemort in some form. That wasn't a difficult conclusion given the scar and the audit report and the detail about the death anchor that Ragnarok had mentioned, which Harry had read about subsequently and which confirmed what the thing on the back of Quirrell's head was in terms of soul mechanics. A fragment. Bound to a living host by necessity and desperation and the particular kind of dark magic that made other dark magic look reasonable by comparison. The stone on the third floor was the obvious nexus. Whatever was stored behind that locked door was something Quirrell, Voldemort, wanted, and the visits to the corridor suggested they were either trying to access it or studying how to access it, and hadn't succeeded yet, which meant there were protections in place that were currently effective. The question was what those protections were and how long they'd stay that way. Harry had a theory about one of them. He'd been reading about the Mirror of Erist, not a known reference to this specific context, but the magical theory of objects that revealed deep desire and the interesting property some such objects had of refusing to cooperate with impure intent. If the stone's final protection involved one of those objects, then the problem solved itself in a very elegant way. The problem with elegant solutions was that they relied on assumptions, and Voldemort in any form was not an assumption-safe variable. He banked hard on the broom and shot down the length of the pitch at full speed, the November air cold and knife-edged, and thought, what does he actually need me to do? Because the thing that bothered Harry most about the whole situation was the passivity of the expected response. He could feel, very clearly, that Dumbledore's plan, whatever it was, involved Harry being somewhere specific at a time not of Harry's choosing, reacting to events that had been allowed to develop to a particular point. The stone left accessible enough to be attempted. The corridor forbidden enough to be enticing. The whole architecture of it felt, to Harry, like a mechanism. And he'd spent 10 years being a mechanism. He wasn't interested in doing it again. He pulled up from the dive, leveled out, and went looking for the snitch. Found it in 14 seconds, hovering near the far goalposts. Caught it without breaking stride. He needed to talk to Neville. Neville had, over the course of October and into November, become what Harry thought of as the best kind of friend, the kind who asked questions and meant them, who didn't perform interest or manufacture concern, who was just there and honest and consistently himself. He'd also, under the combination of Harry's unstated but genuine expectation that he was competent and Professor Sprout's total belief in him in herbology, begun to noticeably fill out his own skin. He was still anxious. He was still quick to assume the worst about his own abilities. But the anxiety had started to have a different quality, the anxiety of someone who knew they could do the thing but hadn't quite started believing they would yet, rather than the anxiety of someone who had genuinely never succeeded and expected to keep not succeeding. Harry had watched this development with great satisfaction and said nothing about it, because the best thing you could do for someone's growing confidence was treat it as entirely expected rather than remarkable. Thursday evening, in the common room, Neville was working through a herbology essay with the focused efficiency of someone who had realized that topics they understood were actually enjoyable to write about. Harry was sitting across from him doing something that looked like astronomy homework and was actually a diagram of the third-floor corridor from memory, with annotations. "Can I ask you something weird?" Harry said. "All your questions are weird," Neville said, without looking up. That's not a criticism. Fair. What do you know about the Philosopher's Stone? Neville looked up. The alchemical thing. Turns base metals to gold, produces the elixir of life. Yes. What would you do if you found out one was being stored at Hogwarts? Neville put down his quill with the care of someone setting something down in order to give their full attention to something else. Is that a hypothetical? Mostly. Harry. The third-floor corridor. I've been up there. Harry kept his voice low. The common room was busy, but the noise of it created its own privacy, and they were in the back corner, which Harry had chosen deliberately. I can feel something through the door. It's old and it's dense and it's heavily warded. Neville was quiet for a moment, processing. This was, Harry had come to appreciate, one of his most valuable qualities. He didn't jump to conclusions or perform reactions. He thought, and then he said what he thought. And Quirrell has been going up there, Neville said. It wasn't a question. He'd been watching Quirrell with the peripheral wariness of someone who grew up in a wizarding family and had a working instinct for when something magical was wrong. At least 5 times that I can track, Harry said. And Quirrell isn't alone. Neville absorbed this. Who else? Not who. What? Harry tapped his pen on the diagram. I need to get in and look at the protections. Not to interfere with them. To understand them. So that if things go wrong before the end of the year, I know the terrain. When you say things go wrong, someone tries to get to the stone through the protections and succeeds. And you want to stop that from happening. I want to know enough to stop it. There's a difference. Harry looked at him. Do you want to come? Neville picked up his quill. Put it down again. Picked it up. McGonagall will be furious, he said. Probably, Harry agreed. And Dumbledore will do something. I don't know what. But something. Yes. And the 3rd floor is actively dangerous. There's a Cerberus behind the first door, Harry said. I could smell it from outside. 3-headed dog, very large. The fact that it's sleeping suggests there's music involved, probably a specific instrument hidden in the room, because that's the standard method for a 3-headed dog. You researched the standard method for a 3-headed dog. I read ahead in Fantastic Beasts. The point is it's manageable. Harry looked at him. I'm not going to let anything happen to you. I know, Neville said, with complete simplicity, and the completeness of his certainty was something Harry felt in his chest in a very particular way. I know you won't. He picked up his quill a final time and made a decision with his face. Saturday night. Saturday night, Harry agreed. Hermione, who had been sitting 3 chairs away and had clearly been listening for the last 5 minutes while appearing to read her charms textbook, said without looking up, I'm coming too. Harry and Neville both looked at her. You've been cataloging this since October, she said, still without looking up. You kept going to the library for books that weren't on the curriculum, specifically, the metallurgical history section, the ward theory section, and twice to the restricted section with permission slips from Flitwick that you got by asking him very specific questions about defensive enchantments in a way that made him feel you were academically curious rather than practically motivated. She turned a page. I keep track of things. I'm coming. Hermione, Neville started. The 3rd floor almost certainly has protections designed to test different skills, she said. Neville is exceptional at magical creatures and herbology. You're exceptional at everything, which is helpful but also means you might miss something in the areas you're less focused on. I am specifically excellent at charms, logic puzzles, and identifying curse signatures. She finally looked up. You need me. She said this last part with the specific confidence of someone who has done the math. Harry looked at her for a moment and then said, yes. We do. Saturday night. Hermione went back to her charms book with the satisfied expression of someone who has won an argument they planned 3 days in advance. Snape stopped Harry in the corridor on Friday morning. Not dramatically. Not with the corridor-sweeping entrance and the significant pause. He simply stepped out of a doorway as Harry was walking past, alone, on his way to the library, and said, "A word, Mr. Potter." Harry stopped. Looked at him. Snape examined him for a moment with the particular look Harry had noticed he used when he was trying to read something he wasn't certain of, dark eyes sharp and careful in the corridor light. "You are going to do something inadvisable," Snape said. "I don't know what specifically. I can tell because you have been very consistent in your behavior for the past 6 weeks, which means you are either genuinely that methodical or you are performing methodical in order to create a baseline so that a deviation goes unnoticed." He paused. "I suspect the latter." Harry said nothing. "I am not here to stop you," Snape said. "I am here to tell you one thing, which I'm going to tell you once, and which I expect you to remember." He looked at Harry with an expression that Harry had been trying to decode for 6 weeks and was only now, in this specific quality of morning light, beginning to understand. Under the hostility, under the years of cultivated distance, under everything that had to do with Harry's father and Harry's mother and the particular intersection of those two things, under all of that was something that was not warmth exactly, but was the specific shape that care took in a person who had decided long ago that caring directly was too dangerous. Whatever you're planning, do not, under any circumstances, trust that the protections in place are sufficient. They were designed under specific assumptions about who might attempt to circumvent them. Those assumptions did not account for the current variables. "You know about the stone," Harry said. Snape's expression didn't change. "I know about quite a few things. That is both my greatest asset and my most significant inconvenience." A pause. "One more thing. The defense professor is not well. This is known. What may not be known is that his condition is worsening faster than anticipated. The timeline is shorter than anyone has been led to believe." He looked at Harry steadily. "I would not waste December on preparation you should have done in November." He turned and walked away. Harry stood in the corridor for a moment, watching him go, and updated his internal model of Severus Snape significantly and rapidly. The man was not an ally in any conventional sense. He was something more complicated than that, a person with his own set of loyalties and his own private calculations, who had looked at Harry and made a decision about him that was independent of every expectation he'd arrived with. Who was, in his own oblique and infuriating way, telling Harry to hurry up. Harry went to the library and changed his timeline from Saturday to that night. He found Neville and Hermione at lunch and said, simply, "Tonight," and Neville went slightly pale and Hermione closed her book and nodded with the expression of someone who has been waiting for the schedule to move. They met at midnight, under Harry's invisibility cloak, which was in his vault at Gringotts and which Sharpclaw had arranged to have delivered to him, along with a letter noting that it was a Potter family heirloom and had been held in the legacy vault under conditions Harry had only just become entitled to meet, and made their way through the castle. Harry had never used the cloak before. Under it, the three of them pressed close together in the narrow dark, Hermione's elbow in his ribs, Neville's breath warm at his shoulder, and the castle felt different. Not smaller. More honest, somehow. All the performed grandeur stripped away, just the old stone doing its real work, holding heat and memory and the weight of centuries. They took the back staircase. Harry kept his awareness wide, listening to the hum. The castle was quiet at this hour. Not empty, he could feel presences in offices, in the staff room, in the headmaster's tower, but settled. Not suspicious. The third floor was cold. The corridor smelled of stone and something else, the particular animal density of something large and alive, threaded through with old hay and what was unmistakably dog. Harry stopped at the door, put his hand flat against it. The presence beyond it was massive and sleeping and he could feel, very faintly, a magical vibration that his research had told him was the residue of the soporific music, still cycling on some enchanted instrument beyond the door. He looked at Hermione. She had her wand out and was running a careful diagnostic over the door's locking mechanism. "Standard Alohomora won't touch this," she murmured. "It's a goblin-forged lock. Wait, no, that's interesting." She frowned. It's a goblin-forged lock that's been modified with a wizard-made override. The override is quite recent. Recent? How recent? Harry said. Within the last week. She looked at him. Someone has already been through this. More actions. Right, the next chapter now. Chapter 4, The weight of knowing. December arrived with the particular rudeness of Scottish winter, not gradually, not with the polite transitional chill of November giving way, but all at once, the temperature dropping overnight into something that made the corridors feel like the inside of a stone that had never once been warm. The lake froze at the edges. The Ollery became a thing of misery. Harry, who had grown up in a house where the heating excluded his cupboard on principle, found the cold entirely manageable and spent a fair amount of time on his broom in conditions that made other students watch from inside with expressions of genuine concern. He was not avoiding the castle. He was thinking. The month since the third floor had been quiet in a way that had a quality to it, not the quiet of nothing happening, but the quiet of multiple things happening slowly and underground, like water working through limestone. The DMLE investigation was ongoing and produced weekly updates that Sharpclaw forwarded to him via OWL, written in the clipped, neutral language of official proceedings that Harry had learned to translate into what was actually occurring. What was actually occurring was that the case was building steadily towards something significant, and Amelia Bones was doing it with the methodical patience of someone who had decided to do it properly or not at all. The ICW inquiry was less organized and more political and moved with the pace of an institution that had been navigating competing interests for centuries, which was to say slowly and with elaborate pretense that this was thoroughness rather than avoidance. Dumbledore had not pressed for the meeting. Harry had declined. He moved through the castle with his usual composed warmth, greeting students by name, appearing at meals and classes and in the corridors at the specific moments that suggested his presence was curated rather than accidental. He looked at Harry occasionally across the great hall with an expression that was patient and complicated, and that Harry had started to read as a man waiting for something, for Harry to come to him, or for Harry to act in a way that required him to respond, or possibly just for the weight of what he'd done to become something they could talk about rather than something that existed purely in legal documents. Harry was not ready to give him that yet. He had his reasons. Quirrell was getting worse. This was not visible to most students. The stutter was consistent. The nervousness was consistent. The general impression of a man who had gone slightly to pieces during his sabbatical and hadn't fully reassembled himself remained intact and convincing. But Harry, who had been paying precise attention since the first week, could feel the deterioration the way you felt a structural change in a building, not in any single obvious thing, but in the accumulation of small signals. The way Quirrell moved sometimes with a surety that didn't match his usual hesitance, and then caught himself. The way the cold presence in the turban had, in the last 2 weeks, become occasionally audible in Quirrell's voice at certain moments, a different register, lower and older, appearing in the middle of ordinary sentences and disappearing before anyone noticed who wasn't specifically listening for it. Harry was specifically listening for it. What he'd noticed this week was that Quirrell had stopped going to the third floor. The magical residue of his visits, which Harry checked periodically via the castle's own memory, palm flat to the corridor wall, had gone cold. The last visit had been 5 days ago. Before the potions room, Harry thought, Quirrell hadn't passed the swapped bottles because Harry had fixed them on the way out, which meant that trip, at least, had stopped at the potions logic. The thing that had stopped him was the same thing every time, the mirror. Voldemort in the turban had not solved the mirror problem and didn't appear to be getting closer to solving it through direct application of will, which was probably the mechanism by which he'd been trying. Harry didn't think Voldemort was capable of the necessary mental reorientation to approach the mirror correctly. The desire to use the stone was so fundamental to his condition, was, perhaps, the whole reason for his continued existence in this form, that asking him not to desire it was structurally impossible. You couldn't want the stone only to prevent someone else from having it when the reason you needed to prevent someone else was that you wanted it yourself. This meant Quirrell was stuck. And stuck Quirrell was trying other approaches. Harry knew this because his defense against the dark arts class had shifted in the last 3 weeks in ways that were subtle but precise. The topics had moved from theoretical overview into specific practical areas, curse identification, resistance to mental compulsion, the theory of soul-based magic and its counters. Quirrell taught these sections with a different quality of attention, the drowsy professorial distraction replaced by something sharper and more focused, and sometimes he looked at Harry while he taught in a way that had nothing in it of the earlier skittering avoidance. Whatever Voldemort was planning, it involved Harry. Of course it did. The scar. The death anchor. The fact that Ragnarok had mentioned the fragment that lived in Harry's scar and its connection to the one Voldemort was currently occupying, and the specific magical mechanic by which two fragments of the same soul recognized each other and were, in certain circumstances, drawn together. Harry had read everything he could find on Horcruxes in the restricted section, which was considerably less than you'd hope and considerably more than the subject deserved to have written about it. He'd found 2 books, one that danced around the topic in horrified euphemism and another that addressed it with the flat clinical precision of a poisoner's manual, and between them he had a working understanding of the mechanics and a clear picture of what was living in his head and what it meant. He hadn't panicked about this. He'd filed it, assessed it, and added it to the list of things that needed addressing in a specific order. The scar fragment was not the most urgent problem because it was currently contained, because Voldemort's inability to access the stone meant he remained in his current limited form, and because the solutions available to Harry for removing it without destroying himself in the process required a level of preparation he hadn't reached yet. It was on the list. It was not at the top. He was thinking about all of this on his broom in the frozen December air when he saw Hermione come out of the castle and stand at the edge of the pitch with her arms crossed against the cold and her scarf pulled up over her nose and her expression visible even from 60 feet up as "Come down, I need to talk to you." He came down. "I found something," she said, before he'd fully dismounted. He walked with her back toward the castle, her slightly faster than was strictly necessary, the cold air carrying their breath away in clouds. "What kind of something?" "I've been cross-referencing the Ward theory texts with what we found on the 3rd floor, she said. "Specifically the protective enchantment structure. The reason Dumbledore used a series of individual challenges rather than a single comprehensive ward system." "Tell me." "Individual challenges have a specific magical property that comprehensive wards don't," she said. She had the quality of someone who had been working up to this moment for several days and was going to give it the proper structure. "They can be attributed. Each one belongs to a specific caster, and the protection of each one is linked to the magical intent of that caster. If a caster loses faith in the purpose of the protection, if they stop believing in what they're guarding, the protection weakens." Harry considered this. "So the protections are only as strong as the people who cast them." "Yes. Which means they're not a static barrier. They're a living system that depends on the continued conviction of everyone involved." She pushed open the castle door and they went into the warmth of the entrance hall. "The Cerberus is Hagrid's, there's no charm on it that Hagrid didn't provide directly, which means as long as Hagrid believes the system is secure, the first door holds. The Devil's Snare is Professor Sprout's. The keys are Flitwick's. The chess set is McGonagall's. The troll," Harry said. "Quirinus Quirrell's," she said. "Which is interesting." She looked at him. "His protection is already compromised. He provided a troll as his contribution, and the troll was already unconscious when we found it. Which means either he knocked it out himself on a prior visit or the protection has degraded to the point of failure because the caster no longer believes in its purpose." Harry stopped walking. "If Quirrell's protection is compromised," he said, "that means the magical structure of the whole system is unbalanced. The layers aren't independent of each other. They're interdependent." "Exactly," Hermione said. "One caster losing faith doesn't just weaken their own challenge. It puts stress on the adjacent protections. The domino effect propagates through the system." She pulled a piece of parchment from her bag and handed it to him. It was covered in diagrams and connected arrows and the particular style of annotation that was purely Hermione, dense, precise, color-coded. "I mapped it. Based on the deterioration of Quirrell's protection and the rate at which the stress propagates through the remaining layers, I estimate that the potions room, which is Snape's, will start to show compromise within the next 2 to 3 weeks. And the mirror room? The mirror is Dumbledore's final protection, she said. It won't fail in the same way the others will. It's tied to his magic personally and his conviction hasn't wavered. But it doesn't need to fail. She paused. If the potion is compromised and you can get through on the basis of a solution that isn't the intended one, which Quirrell has already demonstrated is possible, since you said he'd swapped the bottles, then the mirror becomes the only remaining obstacle. And the mirror can't be circumvented, Harry said. It can only be satisfied. Right. She took the parchment back. Which brings me to the question I've been wanting to ask you for 3 days. She looked at him directly, the way she looked at things she wanted to understand properly. You know how to get the stone from the mirror, don't you? It wasn't quite a question. I think so, Harry said. And you haven't? No. Because? Because getting the stone from the mirror doesn't stop Voldemort, Harry said. It just takes the stone away from him. He'd still be in Quirrell. He'd still be in the castle. He'd still be in my head, technically. He looked at the parchment diagram in her hands. I need to solve the actual problem. Not just the symptom of it. Hermione was quiet for a moment. The actual problem being Voldemort remaining. The actual problem being that as long as there's a fragment of Voldemort attached to me, and a fragment in Quirrell, and other fragments in other places, he stopped. He hadn't told her about the Horcruxes. He'd been deciding whether to, and the decision crystallized now, in the cold entrance hall with Hermione looking at him with exactly the expression of someone who could be trusted with difficult information. I've been reading about soul magic, he said. Specifically about a method of achieving magical immortality by splitting one's soul through a specific act of killing. Hermione went very still. There's a thing called a Horcrux, Harry said. You make one by splitting your soul and binding a piece of it to a physical object. The soul piece survives the death of the body. Voldemort made them. He paused. The fragment in my scar is one. The entrance hall was quiet. A painting of a Tudor-era knight shifted on his canvas. The torches in the brackets gave their slow, warm light. How many did he make? Hermione said. Her voice was completely level. She was processing, not reacting. I don't know for certain. At least one other that I know of, the fragment in Quirrell. Possibly more. He watched her. The important point is that the stone can't solve this. Even if I get the stone and Quirrell doesn't, Voldemort comes back another way. He always comes back another way because there are always more fragments. The stone only matters because it's what's currently keeping him here and keeping him from looking harder for alternative paths. So you're using the stone as a delay mechanism, she said. You're letting him focus on it so he doesn't focus on something more dangerous. While I work out what more dangerous means and how to address it. She looked at him for a long moment with her math equation face, and then the face did something that Harry had only seen a few times, it simplified. The calculation stopped and she just looked at him, and what was in her expression was the specific combination of things that Harry was beginning to understand meant Hermione Granger had decided to be completely on your side. Tell me what you need, she said. Research, Harry said. How to destroy a Horcrux. And specifically, how to remove one from a living host without being fatal about it. She nodded, once, definitively. I'll start tonight. Neville found them both in the library that evening, which was where Harry had been going nearly every free hour for the past 2 weeks, working through the restricted section with permission that Flitwick continued to provide with the generous interpretive framework of someone who had decided Harry's intellectual curiosity was worth accommodating at essentially any level. Neville sat down across from them, put his bag on the table with the thump of someone who has been doing things and needs to tell someone about them, and said, Bane came to see me. Harry looked up from a text on soul theory that was written in 1342 and had the specific unhelpfulness of academic work that was technically thorough and practically useless. Bane the Centaur. He came to the edge of the forest this afternoon while I was in herbology. Neville's expression was careful and a little odd. He said, "Well, he said a lot of things about Mars and Saturn and celestial alignments that I mostly couldn't follow, but the part one did understand was this: he said the stars are showing convergence. A collision of significant forces before the winter ends." He paused. He said specifically that the thing wearing a human face would reach its decision point, and that the youngest of the old lines. He stopped. "I think he meant you." "What did he say about me?" "He said the youngest of the old lines would stand at the center rather than the edge. That the fire would go through the stone, not around it." Neville spread his hands. "That's centaur. I'm translating as best I can." "Through the stone, not around it," Harry repeated. Bane said one other thing. He said the stars don't show the outcome for the fragment. Only two possible futures, one where the center holds and one where it doesn't. Neville looked at Harry steadily. He was very clear that it isn't decided yet. "Good," Harry said. "I prefer undecided." He also said, Neville hesitated, which was unusual for him. He said the debt of old blood would need settling. "I don't know what that means." "The debt of old blood," Hermione murmured, not looking up from her own text. "That's an archaic phrase. It appears in old wizarding contract law, a magical obligation carried through bloodlines, usually from a life debt or a broken vow. If a debt was incurred by a Potter ancestor and never settled, or if someone owes a debt to the Potter line," Harry said. They looked at each other. "Snape," Neville said. Harry nodded slowly. "My father saved his life. According to the story, in their school days. Sirius Black set a prank that would have gotten Snape killed, and James Potter intervened." He looked at his hands. "A life debt is magical. It doesn't go away when the person who incurred it dies. It carries to their blood." "Snape owes you a life debt," Hermione said. "And he came to find you in the corridor and warn you about the timeline." "He's been paying it," Harry said. "Partially. In his own very Snape-specific way." "What does that mean for, whatever you're planning?" "It means I have more allies than I thought," Harry said. "And that the ones I have aren't likely to advertise it." He went back to his book. The three of them worked in the particular comfortable silence of people who have become genuinely synchronized, not the polite quiet of people trying not to disturb each other, but the actual shared quiet of people working toward the same thing. The library was mostly empty at this hour, the other students gone to dinner or the common room, the evening having gone from gray to black outside the high windows. Hermione found something at 8:30. Harry knew because she made a small, sharp sound and went still in the way she went still when something she was reading was genuinely important. "Fiend fire," she said. Harry looked over. "The uncontrollable dark fire. It destroys Horcruxes. It's one of very few things that will. The problem is that it's almost impossible to control and will destroy the caster if they can't contain it." She read further. "There's also basilisk venom, and the killing curse itself directed at a Horcrux, though that has obvious practical limitations." She looked up. "But this is interesting," she turned the book toward him. Harry read. The passage was in a text that was old enough that the ink had faded to sepia and the parchment was stiff with age. "In matters of soul fragments bound to living hosts, the most reliable method of extraction without destruction of the host is the application of concentrated love magic, specifically of the sacrificial variety, which disrupts the binding matrix of the soul fragment without damaging the host's own soul. This method requires a caster of significant emotional clarity and connection to the host, and is not available in most circumstances, but in cases where it is." He stopped. "Love magic," he thought. Sacrificial love magic. He thought about his mother. About the protection that had lived in his blood since he was 15 months old, that had deflected the killing curse and embedded itself in his skin and his magic, and that even Dumbledore's 51 blocks hadn't fully suppressed because it was too fundamental to suppress. The thing that had been in him all along, that the audit report had listed not as an irregularity but as a native magical element. The debt of old blood. Not Snape. Or not only Snape. His mother's sacrifice. The love magic embedded in him at 15 months old. It had been blocking Voldemort from touching him directly for 10 years. It was the reason the death anchor in his scar couldn't fully take hold, couldn't integrate, remained foreign and uncomfortable rather than becoming part of him. It was the reason Quirrell burned when he touched Harry's skin. Harry looked at the text for a long time. Then he closed the book very carefully. "Harry," Hermione said. "I know how to remove it," he said. "The fragment in my scar." He looked at her and at Neville across the table, and his voice was even and factual, and he meant every word of it. "My mother left something in my blood when she died. Love magic. Sacrificial. The most powerful kind." He paused. "When Quirrell touches me, it burns him. Because the dark fragment can't survive contact with that kind of magic. That's why Voldemort can't possess me properly, he keeps getting repelled. So when you touch Quirrell," Neville said slowly. "It goes both ways," Harry said. "The love magic doesn't distinguish. It doesn't burn me. But it destroys the dark magic it touches." He looked at his hands. "If I can get close enough to Quirrell, to maintain contact long enough, the fragment in the turban dies. And the connection between that fragment and the one in my scar is severed." He paused again. "The fragment in my scar is harder. That's a separate problem. But the Quirrell problem, Voldemort's current presence in the castle, solves the same way." "By touching him," Hermione said flatly. "By touching him," Harry confirmed. She stared at him. It's what I have," Harry said. "It's what my mother left me." He said it without drama and without sentiment, because it wasn't dramatic, it was just true. "The most powerful dark wizard of the century cannot touch me without being destroyed. That's not nothing. It's everything," Neville said quietly. Harry looked at him. "It's everything," Neville said again, and his voice had the quality of someone saying something they mean all the way down. "Your mum made sure of that." The library was quiet. The candles guttered slightly in a draught. Harry sat with the weight of what he'd just worked out, not heavy, not crushing, not the kind of weight that bent you. The other kind. The kind that anchored. "Right," he said. "So. The plan." The plan took 3 days to develop because Harry was not willing to have a plan that wasn't complete, and complete meant accounting for every variable he could identify. He made lists. He revised them. He ran scenarios past Neville and Hermione and used their questions, Hermione's precise and structural, Neville's quieter but often pointing at the thing Harry had unconsciously avoided examining, to find the gaps. The primary variables were timing, access, and what happened after. Timing was constrained by Quirrell's deterioration and the protection system's degradation. Hermione's calculation gave them a window of 3 weeks before the potions room became unreliable. Harry wanted to move before that happened, before Voldemort could sense the weakening and accelerate his own approach. Access was the cloak and the mapped route and the plan for each challenge, all of which they now had. What happened after was the complicated one. "After I deal with Quirrell," Harry said, on the third evening, the three of them in the corner of the common room with the fire banked high and the castle dark outside, Voldemort loses his current host. The fragment disperses. The death anchor in my scar is weakened but not removed. Severing the connection between fragments doesn't eliminate either one, it just means they can't reinforce each other. He looked at his plan outline. "I need Ragnarok for the scar fragment. The love magic is the mechanism, but I can't perform it on myself. I need someone who understands soul magic well enough to use my mother's protection as a tool rather than just a passive shield." "Can Ragnarok do that?" Neville asked. "He's been studying it since the audit," Harry said. "He sent me a letter last week." He produced it from his pocket. It was characteristically clipped goblin prose. "Further examination of the native magical element described in Section 7b of your audit report suggests potential application as an active rather than passive defense. This office continues to research. Please advise if timeline changes. Ragnarok. He anticipated this, Hermione said. He's 400 years old, Harry said. He anticipated most of it. He just needed me to arrive at the same understanding so we could have the conversation properly. And the other Horcruxes, Neville said. You said there might be more. There are, Harry said. He'd been sitting with this for weeks and decided now, with the two people who had earned it completely, to say it plainly. I don't know how many or where they are. The diary, there's reference in one of the texts to a diary that Voldemort kept during his school years. And there are others. Finding them is a future problem. Solving the present problem first. Future problem, Hermione repeated, with the tone of someone who finds this framing professionally unsatisfying. Present problem first, Harry said. One thing at a time. She looked at her notes. Fine. But I'm starting a separate list. I know you are, Harry said. She'd already started it. He could see the corner of the parchment. The conversation with Dumbledore happened on a Wednesday, because Harry decided it should and because he'd been sitting with the question of it long enough. He went to the headmaster's office after dinner and knocked, because announcing himself was what he'd decided, and the gargoyle moved and he went up the spiral staircase and knocked on the actual door and Dumbledore said, Come in, Harry, with the quality of a man who had heard the footstep on the stairs and recognized it. The office was what he'd imagined and somewhat more. Portraits of previous headmasters and headmistresses on every wall, some asleep and some watching with the particular portrait attention that was more than painted and less than alive. Instruments of unclear purpose on every surface, silver and delicate and spinning slowly. The pensive in its basin, covered. The phoenix on its perch, Fawkes, who turned his head when Harry came in and regarded him with an eye of extraordinary depth, and made a soft sound that was low and full of something that wasn't music exactly but was adjacent to it. Harry, Dumbledore said. He was sitting behind his desk. He looked older than he had in September, not the physical aging of 2 months, but the kind of aging that came from carrying something you'd been carrying a long time and having recently been required to acknowledge its weight. I'm glad you came. I should have come sooner, Harry said. He sat in the chair across the desk without being invited, which felt correct. I needed to understand things first. And do you? Understand things? More than I did. Harry looked at the portraits on the walls, then at the phoenix, then at Dumbledore. I want to ask you something, and I want you to tell me the truth. Not what you think I should hear. The actual truth. Dumbledore folded his hands. I will try. Why did you put the stone here? Harry said. At Hogwarts. With those specific protections. You could have hidden it anywhere. Why a school? Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. The fire crackled. Fawkes shifted on his perch. Because, Dumbledore said slowly, Voldemort was already here. Harry went still. I knew, before the year began, that he had found a host. I knew, from several sources, that the host was likely to come to Hogwarts. He paused. And I knew that the one thing that could stop him, the one power he could not account for, could not prepare against, could not overwhelm with magic or cunning or force, was here as well. In you. You put the stone here to draw him out, Harry said. Not an accusation. A statement. A confirmation of the theory he'd been sitting with since the library. To give him an objective that would keep him here, contained, focused on one location, rather than allowing him to pursue other avenues of return. Dumbledore's voice was careful and carried something in it that was not quite remorse and not quite justification but was the careful navigation between the two. If he was here, focused on the stone, he was not using the opportunity to consolidate a new body, seek other Horcruxes, build toward a return that I could not monitor or anticipate. You used the stone as bait, Harry said. And you used me as the means to stop him. Yes. The word landed quietly. Dumbledore said it without decoration, without softening, which Harry had not expected and which he found, not comfortable, but honest. More honest than the decorated version would have been. "Without telling me," Harry said. "You were 11, Dumbledore said. "You were, suppressed," Harry said. "You're right that the person you thought I was couldn't have handled this. That person had 93 blocks on his magic and didn't know his own name from a piece of paper." He looked at Dumbledore steadily. "But that wasn't an accident. You made me into that person. The person who couldn't know. And then you made plans that relied on that person not knowing." The fire popped. A portrait shifted. Fawkes made his soft sound again. "Yes," Dumbledore said again. His voice was quieter this time. "The blocks," Harry said. "What were they for? All 51 of yours. What did you think you were doing?" Dumbledore was quiet for a long moment. He looked old, sitting there behind his desk, not weak, not diminished, but genuinely old, the kind of old that has specific things in it rather than just the absence of youth. "The blocks I placed in your first year of life were intended as protection," he said. "You were 15 months old and your magical core was extraordinary. I was afraid that its size and power, uncontrolled, would draw attention from forces I was not yet prepared to counter. The world was not safe, and a child who blazed that brightly was not safe either." He paused. "I told myself they were temporary. That when you were older, when the time was right, I would remove them. And then, time passed. And it became easier to believe that you were safe exactly as you were. That the circumstances that had required the blocks initially had been addressed, and what remained was manageable." Another pause. "I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I have known for some months now with a clarity I did not have before. The intense oppressors," Harry said. "I was afraid of what you might choose," Dumbledore said, and this was the most honest thing he'd said, Harry thought, and probably the hardest. "If you grew up knowing your full capacity, knowing what you were connected to, I was afraid of what you might decide was the appropriate course of action. I wanted to guide those decisions." He looked at Harry with the blue eyes that were ancient and intelligent and genuinely sorry. "I wanted to make sure you would choose what I believed was right." "And the loyalty primer?" Harry said. The silence that followed was a different kind. "The loyalty primer," Dumbledore said very quietly, "was the one I am least able to justify. Everything else I have told myself a reason for. That one," he stopped. "I placed it when you were very young, and I told myself at the time that it was to ensure you would trust the right people, that a child in your position needed a guide and the primer would ensure you accepted that guidance." He met Harry's eyes. "But the honest answer, which I have been sitting with since I read the audit report, is that I placed it because I was afraid. Not for you. Of you. Of the possibility that you would grow up and make decisions I could not control." The fire settled. The flames went lower, steadier. Harry sat with this for a moment. The thing he felt wasn't anger. Anger had been his first instinct, weeks ago, and he'd let it run through and past him like weather. What remained on the other side of anger, when you let it pass rather than holding on to it, was something more complex and more workable. Not forgiveness, not yet. Understanding, maybe. Or the beginning of it. "I know why you did it," Harry said. "I don't think you're a bad man. I think you're a very intelligent man who spent so long being right about things that you stopped checking whether you were right." He paused. "The problem with that is it's the same pattern that made Voldemort. Not the same choices, your choices were better, and you knew it, and you believed that knowing it was enough. But the pattern is the same. The certainty. The willingness to make decisions for other people because you're confident your judgment is superior." Dumbledore looked at him with something Harry could not name that was somewhere between grief and recognition. "I'm going to deal with the situation in the third-floor corridor," Harry said. "Before the end of term. I have a plan and I believe it will work, and I'm not going to tell you the details because I have good reasons for that, which I'll explain afterward." He held up a hand before Dumbledore could speak. I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you so that you're not surprised, and so that if something goes wrong you know to send help to the seventh chamber. He looked at Dumbledore. I want you to trust me. Not because you've decided I'm a useful piece in your plan. Because I'm asking you to. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. And after, he said. If you succeed. After, we need to talk about the other Horcruxes, Harry said. All of them. I know about the concept. I don't know how many or where. That's a conversation for after, when there's time and I have more information. He stood. I also want you to know that the DMLE investigation is going to proceed regardless of what I say about it, because I didn't start it and I can't stop it. Amelia Bones is going to do what she's going to do. I'm not going to speak against you in that process, but I'm not going to speak for you either. What happens there will happen on the evidence. Dumbledore looked up at him from the chair. You know, Dumbledore said, very softly, in 70 years of political life, I have been in this office, as a student, as a professor, as headmaster, and I have had many difficult conversations. Conversations with ministers and aurors and dark lords and everything in between. He paused. I have never been quite so thoroughly outmaneuvered by someone I could pick up and put in a cabinet. Harry almost smiled. You couldn't actually pick me up and put me in a cabinet. No, Dumbledore said. I don't suppose I could. Not anymore. He said it with a specific quality, not resentment, not pride exactly, something that was the particular feeling of watching something become what it was supposed to be, even when that hadn't been your plan for it. Will you let me know? When it's done. Yes, Harry said. I will. He left. In the corridor, on the spiral staircase, he stopped and breathed for a moment. Fawkes, from inside the office, sang one low, long note that came through the stone walls muffled and warm, and Harry stood in it for a moment, in the sound of it, and then went down the stairs and back into the castle. He sent a letter to Ragnarok that night. It was brief. It said, Timeline is moving. Please advise readiness on the scar fragment procedure. I will need your assessment within the next 10 days. HP. The reply came the next morning. 2 lines, procedure is ready. We have been ready for 6 weeks. Come when you must. Ragnarok. Harry folded it and smiled, not a large smile, not a performed one, just the small, real kind that appeared when something fell into place the way it was supposed to. He had one more thing to do before the end of term. He found Ron in the common room after breakfast and sat down and said, I need to ask you something. Ron looked up from a chess game he was playing against himself. Sure. Your brothers. Fred and George. Harry had been watching them since September, the twins who operated with the specific competence of people who were thought to be only funny and were in fact also very sharp. What do they actually know about the castle? Ron looked at him with the expression of someone who has been told a secret and is deciding whether sharing it is allowed. Why? Because I'm going to need information about the castle's secret passages before December ends, Harry said, and I think they have it. Ron studied him. Then he leaned forward. Okay, so. There's this thing they have. It's a map. They found it in their first year, in Filch's office, the map that shows every person in the castle in real time, Harry said. He'd read about it obliquely in a text on the Hogwarts founding wards and had been wondering if it still existed. Yes. I need that. Ron blinked. How did you know? Can you introduce me? Ron stared at him for a moment longer. Then he closed his chess game. Come on, he said. They're in the Ollery being weird about something. They're always in the Ollery being weird about something. They went to find the twins. Fred and George Weasley, when introduced to Harry Potter in the cold of the Ollery with the smell of feathers and the soft sound of 50 owls shifting on their perches, looked at him for exactly 4 seconds and then at each other and then back at him. You know, Fred said, we had a bet. On whether you were exactly as interesting as the sorting made you look, George said. Or more interesting. Or significantly more interesting. George grinned. Ron says more. Ron is correct, Harry said. He looked at them both, the sharp eyes, the ease between them, the quality of two people who had developed their own language over years and used it so fluently that everything they said had a second layer. I want the map. I'll tell you why and what I'm going to use it for. And I want to offer you something in exchange. Information. Fred said. A very specific piece of information about a passage that isn't on the map, Harry said. Because the map was made from the founding wards and one passage was added after, by a headmaster who used it to bring in things he didn't want the staff to see. It's under the statue of the one-eyed witch on the 3rd floor and it goes to Honeydukes in Hogsmeade. The twins stared at him. We have been in this school for 3 years, Fred said. 3 years, George confirmed. And we have never, how do you know that, they said together. I can feel the castle, Harry said simply. The map shows people. The castle tells me passages. He looked at them. Deal. The twins exchanged one of their fast, private looks. Then they produced the map from Fred's pocket, a worn piece of parchment that looked blank until Fred tapped it and said, I solemnly swear that I am up to no good, and the map bloomed into existence, ink spreading across the parchment in a spidery network of corridors and rooms and tiny labeled dots. Harry looked at it. Every person in the castle, named and moving. He found himself on it, Harry Potter, a dot standing in the orrery between Fred Weasley and George Weasley. He found Quirrell in his office. He found Dumbledore in his tower. He found a dot he didn't recognize in the 3rd floor corridor, moving slowly toward the locked door. He looked at the label on the dot. Quirinus Quirrell. But Quirrell was in his office. The dot there was clear and labeled. He looked at the 3rd floor dot again. Read the name again. It wasn't Quirrell's name. It was a second label, smaller, half hidden underneath the first, the way the map showed people who were sharing a body, apparently, one label on top of the other, the true name underneath the assumed. The name underneath read, Tom Marvolo Riddle. Harry handed the map back to Fred. Tonight, he said. It needs to be tonight. The twins looked at him. Something in his voice had made their grins drop. Fred was looking at the 3rd floor dot. He'd read the label. Bloody hell, he said quietly. Yes, Harry said. I need you to watch the map tonight. If any faculty member besides Quirrell moves toward the 3rd floor, I need to know immediately. Can you do that? We can do that, George said, with none of the performance. Just the answer. Thank you, Harry said. He looked at the map one more time, all its moving dots, all its labeled passages, all its living record of the castle doing its work. He thought of the castle's own memory, the way it recorded presences without commentary, the way it had told him about 5 visits and given him the shape of what was coming. He'd been preparing for this since October. Since Gringotts, really. Since the Sorting Hat said I will not in a voice loud enough for the whole hall to hear and Harry had sat on a 3-legged stool and not panicked. He was ready. Tell Ron, Harry said. He'll want to know. He left the orrery and walked back into the castle with the particular feeling of someone who has been moving towards something for a long time and can finally see the distance close to nothing. The cold air came in off the grounds and the winter light was low and golden and the stone underfoot was solid and familiar and the hum was there, steady and constant. Tonight, he thought. The castle agreed. Chapter 5, The Corridor That Breathes. Harry ate dinner. This was, he thought, either a sign of remarkable composure or evidence that 11-year-olds had a fundamentally different relationship to impending danger than adults did, an inability to fully internalize threat because the nervous system hadn't yet learned to catastrophize at scale. He ate shepherd's pie and a bread roll and drank his pumpkin juice and listened to Ron describe a chess strategy that had apparently been developed by his Uncle Bilious and never successfully executed by anyone because Uncle Bilious tended to forget which color he was playing halfway through, and Harry laughed in the right places and meant it. Neville kept catching his eye across the table with the steady, quiet attention of someone who was afraid but not panicking, which was the exact right kind of afraid. Hermione ate carefully and didn't speak much, which for Hermione indicated internal processing rather than anxiety. She had the look of someone running final calculations. The staff table was its usual arrangement. Dumbledore at the center. McGonagall to his left. Snape at the far end, eating with the efficient dispatch of someone who considers meals an interruption. Quirrell in his seat, turbaned, staring at his plate with the particular quality of absence Harry had been tracking for months, the quality of a man who was not entirely in charge of his own attention anymore. Quirrell looked up once, across the full length of the great hall, and his eyes found Harry with the precision of something that knew exactly where to look. Harry held the eye contact for 2 seconds and went back to his shepherd's pie. Let him know. Let Voldemort, in whatever form he currently occupied Quirrell's attention, understand that Harry was aware and unafraid. It didn't change the plan. It established something, that whatever happened tonight was a meeting, not an ambush. Harry had always thought that was cleaner. After dinner he went up to the common room with Ron and Neville and Hermione, and they sat by the fire, and Ron didn't know yet, but he could tell something was happening, because Ron had the social instinct that people who grew up in large families developed, the ability to read the temperature of a room from its smallest signals. He looked between Harry and Neville and Hermione and said nothing, which was its own kind of understanding. At 9 o'clock Harry said, "I'm going to bed early." He wasn't going to bed. He went up to the dormitory and came back down with his cloak under his arm and sat in the chair closest to the fire and waited for the common room to empty. It took an hour. The last person out was a fourth-year girl who fell asleep over her Transfiguration essay and woke herself up with a start and gathered her things and went upstairs with the dazed, affronted look of someone who had been ambushed by unconsciousness. Then it was just the 4 of them. Ron looked at the cloak and then at Harry and then at Neville, who gave him a look that contained an entire conversation. "Right," Ron said, with the tone of someone who has decided to not be left out of whatever this is. "I'm helping." "You're staying here," Harry said. You have the map." Harry produced it from his pocket. The twins had given it to him at dinner, passed across the Gryffindor table under a plate, no commentary. "Watch it. If any teacher moves toward the 3rd floor in the next 2 hours, you send Hermione's cat through the portrait hole and you bang on the wall twice. That's the signal." He looked at Ron. "This is not a lesser job. This is the job that means no one surprises us from behind." Ron looked at the map. At Harry. "Okay," he said. "But you come back." "Obviously," Harry said. "I'm serious." "I know." Harry looked at him, at the genuine uncomplicated directness of it, the specific quality of Ron Weasley's friendship that was always exactly what it appeared to be with no gap between the surface and the interior. "I'll come back." Ron nodded. Opened the map. Sat back in his chair with the focused confidence of someone who took their assigned task seriously, which Ron always did even when the task looked unserious. "Go on then," he said. "I've got it." Harry put the cloak over himself and Neville and Hermione. They were getting better at moving under it together, less elbow, less stumbling, more of the easy coordination that came from having done it before, and they went through the portrait hole and into the dark castle. The corridors at night had their own character. Different from the castle Harry felt through his palms, different from the castle that hummed during the day under the weight of its occupants. At night the hum was slower, deeper, as if the building itself was breathing at a different rate. The portrait slept. The torches were banked low, orange and amber in their brackets, throwing shadows that moved like something alive and weren't. Harry moved through it with his awareness extended the way Flitwick had taught him, wide and sensitive, the window between feeling and action thin and practiced and ready. He could feel the castle. He could feel the presences in it, sleeping, mostly, some wakeful in their offices and quarters. He could feel the 3rd floor ahead of them as a kind of density, a concentration of magical significance that had been building since September and had reached, tonight, the particular pitch of something about to resolve. He could feel Quirrell on the 3rd floor. Already there. Already through the first door. He moved faster. Hermione caught his arm under the cloak, and when he glanced at her she raised one eyebrow. Careful. He gave a small nod that meant yes, but moving. Neville understood both without commentary. The third-floor corridor was cold. Colder than the rest of the castle, which Harry thought was partly the stone's natural chill and partly something else, the particular cold of magical intent, the way concentrated dark magic dropped the temperature of a space, the way a deep shadow dropped the light. He could feel Quirrell more clearly now, the double presence of it, the two signatures occupying one body, one dimming and desperate and the other ancient and ravenous. The door was open. Not unlocked. Open. The modified lock had been used again, and this time Quirrell hadn't bothered closing it behind him, which told Harry something about his state of mind, or Voldemort's state of mind, more accurately. The urgency of it. The sense that this was the attempt, not a reconnaissance. Something had changed since dinner. Harry stopped in the doorway and parsed it quickly. The dog was asleep, the harp still played, but there was something ragged about the enchantment, like a mechanism running on insufficient power. The music was slower than before. Less reliable. The dog's 3 heads were down but not deeply down, one ear on the leftmost head was twitching slightly, registering sound at the threshold of its sleep. They went around the edge of the room carefully. Harry kept the ambient magical output he was generating, the small, constant light from his palm, the awareness, the readiness, as controlled and quiet as he could make it. Not suppressed. Just precise. The trapdoor was open. They dropped. The devil's snare was already held aside, not by Neville's magic, but by something else, something forceful and impatient that had pushed through rather than asking. The plant was damaged, Harry noticed as he landed, some of the tendrils scorched. Voldemort's tolerance for the delicate solution was apparently low. They went through into the key room. The winged keys were swarming in a different pattern than before, agitated, disrupted, the broom hovering at an odd angle below them as if dropped in haste. Someone had already taken the correct key. The door was open. They went through. The chess room stopped them for exactly 30 seconds. The board had been played through with the reckless, brilliant aggression of someone who didn't care about the sacrifice, white pieces destroyed wholesale to clear the fastest path. McGonagall's enchantment had accepted it. The game was complete. The path was open. He sacrificed everything to win faster, Hermione said quietly. Yes, Harry said. That's what he always does. They went through. The troll was unconscious, same as before. The potions room was clear, the bottles in their correct positions, the black fire and purple fire at each end cold and dark, the protection evidently deactivated rather than navigated. Which meant Snape's protection had failed entirely, as Hermione's calculation had projected, 3 days ahead of schedule. The door to the mirror room was open. Harry stopped outside it. He took his hand off the door frame and turned to Neville and Hermione. The plan, he said, quietly. I know the plan, Neville said. Me too, Hermione said, with the tone of someone who has memorized the plan and several contingency plans and a plan for if the contingency plans fail. This part one do alone, Harry said. Hermione opened her mouth. The love magic is specific to me, Harry said. Lily Potter's sacrifice is in my blood, not yours. If either of you touch Quirrell while Voldemort is inhabiting him, it won't have the same effect. It might have no effect. It might have an unpredictable one. He looked at both of them. You stay here. If I'm not out in 20 minutes you can come in. If I'm not conscious when you come in, you'll be conscious, Neville said. I will, Harry agreed. But if not, the stone will still be in the mirror. Don't try to retrieve it yourself. Send for Dumbledore. Hermione looked like she had several objections lined up in order of severity. She was weighing them all. Hermione, Harry said. Trust me. She held his gaze for a moment. Then, 20 minutes, she said. Not a second more. 20 minutes, he said. He took off the cloak and handed it to Neville, who folded it over his arm with the careful respect of someone holding something that belonged to their friend and needed returning. Harry straightened his robes. He was not wearing armor. He was not carrying anything he prepared for the purpose. He was himself, small, underfed, wearing glasses that were slightly too large, his scar catching the faint light of the corridor, his magic at its full and actual capacity for the first time in his life. He pushed the door open and went in. The mirror room was cold and still and lit by no visible source, just the ambient magical light that collected in a room where something old and significant was present, the kind of light that had nowhere to go and so stayed. The mirror stood in the center exactly as he'd left it, tall and ornate, its surface dark and shimmering. In front of it stood Quirrell. He was speaking to the mirror. Not in English, in something older, something that had the quality of compulsion about it, the rhythmic pressure of someone trying to force an outcome through repetition. His hands were raised, palms toward the glass, and the turban on his head was tight and askew and radiating the specific dark signature that Harry could feel from 20 feet away like a hand pressed flat against his chest. He couldn't see what Quirrell saw in the mirror. From his position behind and to the left, he could only see the back of Quirrell's head and the mirror's surface, which reflected the empty room rather than Quirrell's reflection. The mirror was showing something else, something internal, visible only to the person standing directly before it. Quirrell stopped speaking. He knew Harry was there. He'd known the moment Harry came through the door, the dark thing in the turban had felt it, the specific magical signature of Lily Potter's sacrifice, which Voldemort apparently recognized with the full-body revulsion of something that had been burned by it before. "Mr. P. Potter," Quirrell said. He turned around. His face was wrong. Not Quirrell's face specifically, the features were Quirrell's, the pale skin and the nervous eyes and the general impression of a man assembled from anxiety. But the expression on it was not Quirrell's. There was no stutter in the way it held itself. There was no hesitation in the way the eyes found Harry and settled on him with the full, ancient, assessing weight of something that had been alive for 70 years and dead for 10 and had in those intervening 10 years distilled itself down to a single purpose. "I wondered," Voldemort said, through Quirrell's mouth, "when you would come." Harry stood about 10 feet from him and said nothing. "You've known for some time," Voldemort said. "What I am. What I'm doing here." He looked at Harry with the complete attention of something that was genuinely curious, not performing curiosity, not managing him. Genuinely trying to understand. "You're not afraid." "No," Harry said. "You should be." "Maybe," Harry said. "But fear doesn't change the situation. It just makes it harder to think clearly about it." Voldemort was quiet for a moment. The dark presence in the room shifted, not retreating, but recalibrating. Harry could feel it doing that, the ancient and intelligent thing in the turban feeling the shape of what it was dealing with. "You're nothing like what I expected," Voldemort said. "I planned for the boy they told me about. The boy who grew up ignorant and powerless in a Muggle house, who would come to Hogwarts overwhelmed and grateful and shaped entirely by what Dumbledore made of him." A pause. "That boy does not appear to be here. He was never real," Harry said. "You planned for someone who was manufactured. I know you understand what that means." Something in Voldemort's expression shifted. Still on Quirrell's face, which made it strange, the features weren't built for this depth of attention, weren't built for the specific quality of someone encountering an unexpected equal and knowing it. "Dumbledore's blocks. All 93, Harry said. Gone since September. And the tracking charms. Gone. The loyalty primer." A pause, and in the pause something that Harry read, knowing it was strange, knowing Voldemort was not safe or sympathetic or anything that warranted this reading, as something like recognition. One prisoner understanding another's cage. "He did that to me as well," Voldemort said. "Placed impressions. Made me believe certain things about myself, about what I was, about what was possible." His voice was flat and even. "Not the same mechanism. But the same essential act." "I know," Harry said. He'd thought about this. He'd thought about it in the library and on his broom and in the quiet after the Dumbledore conversation when he was going through everything he'd learned and finding the shapes within it. You and I have that in common. We have more than that in common, Voldemort said. He stepped to the side, not toward Harry, just to the side, a repositioning that was almost like pacing. You know about the fragment. The one in my scar. Yes. Then you know what you are. A Horcrux you made by accident, Harry said. Yes. I know. Not entirely by accident, Voldemort said, and his voice had a quality in it that was the closest thing to candor Harry had ever expected to hear from this direction. I felt the magic in your mother. Even as I cast the killing curse I felt it, a protection so complete, so ancient in its type, that I knew what it would do to my curse. I could have stopped. Walked away from the cottage. Found another body for the Horcrux purpose. He paused. I chose not to, because I believed I could overcome it. I was wrong. He looked at Harry. The fragment that survived in your scar was not planned. But it was not entirely an accident either. It was the consequence of underestimating love magic, which I had always dismissed as sentiment. Another pause. I was wrong about that too. Harry absorbed this. You're telling me things you don't have to tell me. I'm telling you things that are already true whether I tell them or not, Voldemort said. You have read the books. You have worked it out. I am not giving you information you don't have. I am, he stopped. Seemed to consider. I am conducting myself, in this conversation, as the person I was before I became what I became. The person who understood strategy and honesty and the relationship between them. Something moved in the turban. That person is very old and very tired, and he has very little time left in which to be honest with anyone. Quirrell's body was failing. Harry could feel it, not through the dark magic, through the castle, through the ambient awareness that read everything in the room as living or not. Quirrell was burning. Had been burning since September, the host body consumed by the force of what was living in it. The timeline Snape had flagged. The stone, Harry said. You can't get it from the mirror. I know, Voldemort said. He looked at the mirror's dark surface. I have stood before it 9 times. 9 times it has shown me what I would do with the stone, which is precisely what it cannot show me if I am to receive it. He turned back to Harry. The protection is Dumbledore's and it is, appropriate. It fits him. A mirror that gives only to the purely intentioned. A pause. I have not been purely intentioned in a very long time. Neither have I, Harry said. About most things. But about this? Voldemort looked at him. About this, Harry said, I genuinely don't want the stone. I want to stop you having it. Which is different from wanting it myself. Then look in the mirror. I know, Harry said. I know I can get it. That's not why I'm here. A silence. The cold air of the room moved slightly, disturbed by something, the castle breathing, maybe, or the mirror's own quiet magic turning in its frame. Why are you here? Voldemort asked. To end this, Harry said. Not just the stone. Not just you being in Quirrell. The whole thing. The fragment in the turban and what that fragment's existence is doing to you and to Quirrell and to everyone else. You can't kill me, Voldemort said. There was no defiance in it. No performance of invulnerability. Just a statement of fact. As long as the other anchors exist, I cannot die. I know, Harry said. I'm not trying to kill you tonight. He looked at Quirrell's failing face, the pale skin mottled now, the eyes sunken, the body carrying what it carried with the last reserves of a man who'd had very little say in what happened to him. I'm here because of what's in my blood. My mother's gift. And because as long as you're in Quirrell, in this castle, focused on this mirror, you're not somewhere else making this worse. Voldemort was still. You came here to contain me, he said. Not an accusation. Working through it. I came here because you came here, Harry said. Because Snape told me the timeline was short and the potion's protection was failing and I'd run out of time to wait for a more organized version of this conversation. He took one step forward. Just one. Closing the distance between them incrementally, not rushing, not threatening. I came here because you're going to keep coming back as long as the anchors exist, and I know about the anchors, and I have a plan for them that doesn't require you to die tonight. But it requires you to not get the stone first. What is your plan? Voldemort asked. I find the anchors and destroy them, Harry said. All of them. And then whatever you are without them, without the Horcruxes, without the fragments, without the constructed immortality and the decade of desperation, whatever that is, I deal with that when it comes. You destroy them, Voldemort said. The objects. The anchors. One by one. Harry took another step. He was 5 feet away now. He could feel the dark magic clearly, the direct heat of it, the way it pressed against the love magic in his blood, the specific quality of two opposing fundamental forces meeting at a boundary. I'm going to retrieve the stone from the mirror. And then I'm going to give it to Dumbledore, and he's going to give it back to Nicholas Flamel, and then the stone won't exist anymore, and this particular avenue closes permanently. He paused. But first I need you to not be in quarrel. Killing my host won't, I know, Harry said. I'm not planning to kill anyone. He looked at Quirrell, at the man underneath, who had been a reasonably unremarkable defense teacher before his sabbatical and had come back fundamentally changed by something that hadn't asked his permission. When I make contact, the love magic does what it does. The dark fragment in the turban, it won't survive. You'll lose this host. You'll be dispossessed. He met Quirrell's eyes, which were Voldemort's eyes right now, old and cold and ancient. You'll survive as a wraith. You've done it before. It's not death. He paused. I know it's not what you want. But it's not death. And you think, Voldemort said slowly, that this is preferable to what I would do if I retrieved the stone? I think it's preferable to me taking the stone, which I'm also prepared to do, Harry said. And which leaves you in Quirrell with no stone and a dying host and no path forward. He took another step. This way you leave. Quirrell might survive, he might have enough of himself left if the fragment is removed rather than if the host dies while containing it. You're offering me mercy, Voldemort said. He said it without contempt. Without mockery. With what Harry could only describe as the complex and specific attention of someone for whom mercy had been, for a very long time, completely outside the frame of what was available to them. You. Of all people. I'm offering you a choice, Harry said. Because you haven't had one for 10 years and I know what that's like. And because whoever you were before, he stopped. The man who made the first Horcrux chose this. But everything after that choice, all the consequences, all the things you had to do and the things done to you, you didn't choose those. They were the logic of the first choice, playing out. Do not feel sorry for me, Voldemort said, and this time there was something in it, not quite heat, not quite warning. Just a very specific kind of dignity. I am not a victim of my choices. I made them. I'm not feeling sorry for you, Harry said. I'm being accurate about what happened. He was 3 feet away. Do you know what the worst thing Dumbledore did to me was? A silence. Not the blocks, Harry said. Not the tracking charms. The loyalty primer, the thing he placed so that I would always trust him, always defer to him, always feel in his presence like I was safe and he was right. He looked at the ancient, trapped thing in Quirrell's body steadily. He took away my ability to choose him honestly. He made me trust him without asking me to. And then everything that trust built, all of it, was built on a foundation I didn't know was manufactured. And? Voldemort said. And I still ended up here, Harry said. Doing what I believe is right, working with people I actually trust, making decisions for my own reasons. He met those old eyes. The manipulation didn't determine the outcome. I did. You are also not determined by what was done to you. I am rather more determined by it than you are, Voldemort said. I am quite literally assembled from the consequences. You're assembled from choices, Harry said. The first one you made freely. That's not the same as being determined. 2 feet. You have, Voldemort said, very quietly, your mother's gift for impossible arguments. I know, Harry said. She gave me a lot of things. He closed the final distance. He reached up with his right hand, and he placed his palm flat against Quirrell's cheek. The effect was not immediate. There was a moment, 1 second, maybe 2, that was simply contact, the specific warmth of a hand against a face in a cold room, the human and mundane reality of touch, and Harry felt, through that contact, the full shape of what he was touching. Not just Quirrell. Not just Voldemort. The whole terrible compressed architecture of what had once been Tom Marvolo Riddle, the frightened orphan boy who had sat in a different headmaster's office and been told he was special and hadn't known that the person saying it would spend decades shaping him into a specific tool just as Dumbledore had shaped Harry, who had made the specific choice that the frightened boy had made when the first person who told him he was powerful also told him that power was the answer to fear. Harry felt all of this through the contact, through the love magic that was his mother's final gift, and he held it without flinching and without pity and without contempt. Then the magic moved. It was not like a spell. It was not like anything Harry had experienced in the controlled precision of wand work or the clean snap of wandless casting. It was something deeper and more total, the love magic rising up from wherever it lived in his blood and moving through his arm and his hand and into the contact point with the complete implacable certainty of something that had been waiting 10 years for an appropriate target. Quirrell screamed. Not in pain, or not only in pain. In the specific way you screamed when something was being removed, when something that had been wedged into a space not made for it was pulled free. Harry held on. His own body felt the backlash of it, the dark magic pushing back against the love magic the way 2 opposing currents pushed against each other at a confluence, and Harry was the point of contact between them, and the strain of it was, he breathed through it. Window, he thought. Flitwick's word. The window between feeling and action. He needed it now between sensation and collapse, the thin clear layer that let him feel everything and still choose. He held on. Quirrell's hands came up and grabbed Harry's wrist, but not to break the contact, to steady himself, the grip of a man whose legs were failing. Harry could feel Quirrell underneath, the real Quirrell, what was left of him, the personality that had been overwritten and suppressed and burned through and was now, as the foreign thing was being stripped away, surfacing into the space it had previously occupied like a waterlogged vessel finally reaching air. The dark thing in the turban was screaming now without a voice. Harry felt it rather than heard it, felt it the way he felt the castle, as a disturbance in the magical field of the room, a frequency going higher and more desperate as the love magic dismantled the binding that held it to the host body. The temperature in the room dropped sharply. And then, the binding broke. Harry felt it go. Like a wire snapping under tension, the specific cessation of strain that was also the absence of the thing the strain had been holding together. The dark fragment dispersed, not destroyed, not fully, but unmoored, dispossessed, no longer anchored to physical matter. It moved through the room like smoke in a high wind. Harry felt it pass through the space where he stood and felt the love magic in his blood rise to meet it and scorch the edges of it and send it shrieking out through the stone walls and into the cold December night. Quirrell collapsed. Harry caught him before he hit the floor. He was heavier than he looked. Harry had not previously had occasion to note that he was strong enough to catch a grown man, and he filed this under things his body could do that he hadn't known before and went down to one knee with Quirrell's weight across his arms, and pressed 2 fingers to Quirrell's neck. Pulse. Weak. Present. Harry looked up at the mirror. The mirror looked back. Its surface was still and dark, and in it, in the reflection, which he had been carefully not looking at all night, he could see himself, kneeling on the stone floor with Quirrell across his lap, and in his reflection's hand was a small red stone. He looked at his actual hand. The stone was there. He had not reached for it. Had not looked into the mirror and wished for it or wanted it or done any deliberate thing to receive it. The mirror had simply given it to him, the way the sorting hat had simply told the truth, the way the castle had simply remembered what it knew. Because the truth was he didn't want it. He wanted no one else to have it. And that, apparently, was entirely sufficient. He closed his hand around it. Put it in his pocket. Behind him, the door opened. Hermione and Neville came in at a run. The 20 minutes long passed. He'd lost track of time entirely somewhere in the section where the love magic was doing its work. Hermione saw Quirrell on the floor and Harry kneeling beside him and made a sound that was mostly breath. Neville came and crouched on Quirrell's other side with the calm efficiency of someone who knew what to look for and was checking. "He's alive," Neville said. "His magic is damaged. But he's alive." "He'll need the hospital wing," Harry said. He looked at Hermione. "I need you to go and get McGonagall. Tell her I said it was over and she should bring Madame Pomfrey." Hermione looked at him. Then at his pocket, where the stone was. "Did you?" "Yes," he said. "Go." She went. Neville sat on the floor beside Quirrell and didn't say anything because he understood when silence was appropriate and this was that. Harry sat back on his heels and breathed and let the aftermath of the love magic settle, the particular exhausted quietness it left in its wake, as if the deepest part of him had spent a very long time doing something significant and needed a moment to register that the work was done. The mirror was behind him. He didn't look at it. He looked at Quirrell, the pale, spent face of a man who had been somewhere very dark for a long time and had just been, not rescued, but freed. Whether he'd be all right was a question for Madame Pomfrey and time and the considerable resilience of human beings who had survived things they hadn't been designed to survive. "You did it," Neville said quietly. "We did it," Harry said. "You got here." "I watched the door." "That's doing it." Harry looked at him. "Neville. The chess room, you played those 3 moves. That was mostly you." "No, you knew how to speak to the pieces. I knew the pattern and you knew the language." Harry looked at him steadily. Both things were necessary. Neville was quiet for a moment. "You always do that," he said. "What?" "Find the thing someone else did and make sure they know it mattered." He said it without sentimentality. "Just an observation. Most people don't do that." Harry thought about this. About the Dursleys, for whom credit was a zero-sum resource hoarded carefully. About Dumbledore, for whom credit was managed as part of a larger narrative. About Neville's grandmother, probably, for whom Neville's achievements were always adjacent to the shadow of the parents who couldn't be present to have them. "It's just accurate," Harry said. Neville smiled at that, the simple, unguarded smile of someone who had decided to believe the accurate thing and found it, in the believing, to be good. The door opened again. McGonagall came through it, and behind her Madame Pomfrey with her healer's bag and the specific brisk competence of a woman for whom no situation was worse than the one she'd already seen. McGonagall looked at Quirrell on the floor and at Harry and at Neville and then at the mirror and then back at Harry, and what was on her face was the specific complex expression that had been there since the Gringotts corridor, grief and recognition and something else, something Harry was only now correctly identifying as pride. The specific kind that didn't belong to the person feeling it but had been earned by someone else and was being held on their behalf. "Mr. Potter," she said. Then stopped. Apparently there was nothing immediately useful to add. Madame Pomfrey was already kneeling beside Quirrell with her wand out, running diagnostics. "He's alive," she confirmed, in the neutral professional tone that was actually reassuring rather than alarming. "He'll need intensive care. His magical core is significantly depleted and there's evidence of sustained magical contamination, but the contamination has been removed. Whatever was done to him has been undone." She looked up at Harry. "How?" "I touched him," Harry said. She looked at him for one long moment with the expression of a healer who has just been given information she suspects is important and is deciding how to categorize it. "I see," she said, and went back to Quirrell. McGonagall looked at Harry's pocket. "The stone," she said. Harry took it out and placed it in her palm without ceremony. She closed her hand around it and then closed her eyes for a moment, just briefly, and Harry understood that whatever she was feeling in that moment was not about the stone itself but about the fact that it was over, that the thing that had been developing since September, maybe since longer, had reached its conclusion in this cold room without catastrophe, and she had spent 3 months watching it develop and being unable to intercede and not knowing if it would be all right. "Are you hurt?" she asked. "No," he said. He was exhausted. He was experiencing the deep, complete tiredness that followed a significant magical expenditure, the kind where your body and your magic and your actual self all needed sleep simultaneously. But he wasn't hurt. "I'm fine. I just need to sleep." Then, she stopped herself. There were things she could say and she was deciding not to say them. "Then I think we should get you back to the tower." She looked at Neville. "Both of you." "McGonagall," Harry said. She turned. "Thank you," he said. "For coming down here in September. To Gringotts. You didn't have to stay all night." She looked at him with the expression of someone who finds being thanked for something they consider basic decency professionally awkward. "Of course I stayed," she said. You are my student." "I know," Harry said. "That's why it mattered." She turned away before the expression could develop further, and busied herself with directing Madame Pomfrey in a way that was not actually necessary but gave her hands something to do. Harry got up from the floor. His legs were steady. He walked to the mirror one last time and stood in front of it, this time looking directly into the surface. His reflection looked back. Small. Messy-haired. Wearing Dudley's 2 big robes and his 2 large glasses. The same as he'd looked every morning in the mirror in the Dursleys' bathroom, the same face he'd been seeing his entire life without knowing what it contained. In the reflection, his hands were empty. The stone was already gone, already in McGonagall's possession. He wasn't holding anything. He looked at the reflection for a moment longer. His heart's desire. He thought he understood, looking at the empty-handed reflection, what it was showing him. Not a specific object. Not a specific person. Just, himself. The version of himself that was free. The version that had made choices because they were his choices and not because someone's blocks and primers and careful architectural management had predetermined the menu of choices available to him. Just Harry. Hands empty and not minding. He looked away from the mirror and walked back toward the door where Neville was waiting and McGonagall was organized and Quirrell was going to be all right and the stone was safe. Ron was still in the armchair with the map when Harry and Neville came through the portrait hole at midnight. He was sitting forward with his elbows on his knees, the map open between his hands, watching it with the precise focused energy of a person who takes his assigned task very seriously and has been doing so for 3 hours. He looked up when they came in. Took them both in, upright, ambulatory, intact. Let out a breath. "Map shows Quirrell was moved to the hospital wing," he said. "And McGonagall and Pomfrey are both down there." He looked at Harry. "And Dumbledore walked to the hospital wing about 10 minutes ago." He paused. "And there's no one on the 3rd floor anymore." "No," Harry said. "There isn't." Ron looked at him for a moment. Then he held out the map. Harry took it, tapped it, mischief managed, and the ink vanished. He put it in his pocket to return to the twins in the morning. "Come and sit down," Ron said. "Hermione went to bed. Well, she said she was going to bed and she's definitely sitting behind her curtains reading something, but still." He moved to make room by the fire. Fred and George left food. There was, indeed, a plate of food on the side table, sandwiches and crisps and 2 chocolate frogs and a note in the twins' joint handwriting that said simply, "Well done. Details owed. FNG." Harry sat down and ate a sandwich, and it was the best sandwich he'd ever had in his life, which was partly because he was tired and partly because he was alive and partly because the fire was warm and the common room was quiet and the stone was in McGonagall's hands and the fragment in Quirrell's turban was gone. The fragment in his own scar was still there. He could feel it, the same dull foreignness he'd felt his whole life, dimmer now without the reinforcing connection to the Quirrell fragment, but present. That was tomorrow's problem. And the other Horcruxes. And the DMLE investigation. And Dumbledore, and whatever came after the conversation they'd already had. All of that was tomorrow. Tonight there was a fire and food and Neville eating a chocolate frog with the satisfied air of someone who has done what needed doing, and Ron who had stayed in his chair for 3 hours watching a map because he was asked to, and that was the kind of person Ron was, loyal in a specific way that didn't announce itself. Harry leaned back in his chair and looked at the fire and felt, for the third time since September, exactly like himself. Not a weapon. Not a mechanism. Not Dumbledore's chess piece or Voldemort's Horcrux or the boy who lived whose function had been predetermined before he could walk. Just Harry. 11 years old. First year. Gryffindor, as it turned out. Owner of a slightly excessive number of Gringotts vaults and one very fine invisibility cloak and one Nimbus 2000 and the slowly growing, extraordinary, everyday richness of people who had chosen to be his friends because of who he actually was rather than who they'd been told he was. He closed his eyes. Slept, in the chair, before he even decided to. The fire burned low and steady. Outside, the December wind moved across the grounds and the lake was frozen white and the castle hummed its old, patient hum, the sound of a building that had been doing its work for 1,000 years and would go on doing it, and it recognized the boy asleep in the Gryffindor armchair with the particular recognition of very old things for the people who belonged to them. It hummed. He slept. The stone was safe. The fragment was gone. The world was not fixed, was nowhere near fixed, was in fact arguably more complicated now than it had been at the start of term, but the immediate part was done, and the rest could wait for morning. Morning would come. It always did.